I'm Michael. I'm with Alex and Mason. I have a glass of red wine and a bottle of white wine right next to it because I'm ready to talk about the most serious of video game novels. As we're back with Fallin Thru Plotholes, episode 1-2, Final Fantasy X. Death is a big deal unless you really don't want to. Alex, Mason, I got a question for y'all.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to sing a pop song to get two warring sides to stop fighting and come together as one for the greater good, what song would you sing?
I Want It That Way by Backstreet Boys.
Very good. Very good. I think that would be solid. I think that would really... it would get people dancing, at the very least. And dancing is dancing's the first step towards familiarity with the enemy and bring him together. Mason, I know you are totally into music and have a track ready for this. So what do you got?
Yeah, in a similar vein, I was thinking something by Lady Gaga, maybe Just Dance. That one always seems to get people's moods going.
Yeah, look at it. Y'all are going with actual good answers, and that's great because the answer I have would be A1 Temporary Secretary by Paul McCartney, which is a song, if you haven't heard of that before, it will leave you very confused and ill. And I feel like if you're very confused and ill, you can't fight your enemy. So I think that would go a long way towards stopping any sort of war.
What happens when the confusion and the illness wears off and you're just angry that you were forced to listen to a song like that?
Well, then you team up and you fight the person who sung that song. And by that time, I'm running in the opposite direction because I have an airship.
You know what? Fair.
So yeah, we're talking about Final Fantasy X-2!
Yay!
Yeah! Yeah, so last time we talked about Final Fantasy X, a game with a very somber story that, in my opinion, is, for the most part, well-written, well-executed. Today, we're going to be getting into stories that are a little bit more, let's say, polarizing? I think polarizing would be a safe term to refer to.
Yeah, that's probably a fair way to put it.
Yeah, because we're going to be talking about the first Final Fantasy sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, and then we're going to be talking about a really terrible novel that's right after that, which, boy, am I excited to inflict that upon you all. Both,
I don't think the novel is nearly as polarizing. I think people are pretty unified about that one.
My favorite line from the Wikipedia entry about the Final Fantasy novel, which, Mason, you're going to like this name. It's called Final Fantasy X 2.5.
At least they weren't ready for 3.
They weren't quite ready for 3. But the final line in it is something along the lines of Japanese readers were mostly negative on this book. And it was just one single line and that just ends the article. And it's like, no, fair. So, Alex, I'm pretty sure you've played Final Fantasy X-2.
I have, yes.
Yeah, and Mason, I'm pretty sure you haven't played Final Fantasy X-2.
Nope, I definitely haven't.
So this is going to be exciting because I'm going to get two different perspectives on this. I'll start with Alex. What's your experience playing Final Fantasy X-2?
My experience summed up is I'm not sure a game has ever beaten the goodwill towards it out of me harder than Final Fantasy X-2.
Oof.
My first few hours with that game were a delight, and it was downhill from there.
Those are some harsh words.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I've come around on Final Fantasy X-2. I should explain how even I got to playing Final Fantasy X-2 in the first place. I didn't buy it when it was new. How I came to own it is because I was a really dumb kid, and I had 2 copies of Chrono Trigger for the Super Nintendo.
All right.
And I traded one of those copies away for the Chrono Trigger Strategy Guide, which that was good, and a copy of Final Fantasy X-2 and the Final Fantasy X-2 Strategy Guide from Brady Games, which is hilariously inaccurate.
Do you think that was a fair trade?
Remember... Well, you got the Chrono Trigger strategy guides. That's sort of a fair trade.
Yeah, and that's a good strategy guide too. It's a Nintendo Power Guide. It's pretty awesome. Has some pre-release screenshots in there that aren't in the game. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Nintendo Power Strategy Guides are good. Those are quality.
Oh yeah, they're so good. They're so good. So yeah, like when I played through the game initially, I had already kind of seen the backlash against this game, like kind of the mixed reviews that it had. Mm-hmm. And so I came into it with kind of low expectations and ended up being pleasantly surprised by it.
Okay.
Now, granted, the gameplay of this is a game where you only have 3 party members, and they're not necessarily unique.
Right.
Instead, it has a job system where you use items called dress spheres in order to dress your characters up to fun little costumes, and then they take on jobs like Black Mage or Knight or what have you. And given my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time is Final Fantasy V, which has a job system, I was instantly like, okay, no, this is right up my alley. This is great.
Okay. So I do like that system. In general, I think I like the combat in 10-2. And I do like the job system. I like the ways it actually lets you play within an experiment. Mm-hmm. So I'm with you on that. It's really, ironically enough, the narrative elements, and it's not even... I don't even dislike the story, really. And it's not even that the first 60% of that story is, like, just the fluffiest. It's just nothing.
Yeah.
Like you spend an hour engaging with the plot, and then about 25 engaging with nothing. And then, like, 15 hours with the game going, oh, right, the plot, here.
Yeah. So, Mason, just to kind of give you an idea of how this game is structured, like, most RPGs are very linear, right? You go from point A to point B to point C, and plot happens along the way. Mm-hmm. Final Fantasy X-2 is a lot different in the sense that, you can go basically anywhere you want right at the start of the game. And the whole idea is that you're sort of just revisiting areas and seeing people you've already met in the previous game and kind of being like, oh man, what is this person up to? But never ever like advancing the plot except in some key moments. Which, it's good for a summary perspective. We're probably going to get through this game pretty darn quick, but yeah, it's a lot of fluff because it's a very fan servicey sort of game. And there's a reason for that once we talk about the development a bit will make a lot more sense. But yeah, I'm kind of... I kind of like that sort of openness sort of stuff. Like, just being, like, go anywhere and, like, it's not necessarily that important. But yeah, it does mean that the plot is broken up in some really weird ways. I definitely will agree with that.
Yeah. So I think my biggest gripe with my experience with the game, I don't know if I even want to discuss right now. But I guess I will, because, Mike, you mentioned that you got a good deal, that you got the Chrono Trigger Strategy Guide and 10-2, and the 10-2 Strategy Guide.
Yeah.
And I also got 10-2 with the 10-2 Strategy Guide. I think I got it as a gift from aunt and uncle. And they didn't know much about video games, but I think we had mentioned that we liked, my brother and I, we liked Final Fantasy X, and so they sort of went with this. And at first, being the very serious professional gamer that I was, I scoffed at, strategy guide. Haha, I do not need this. I know video games.
Oh, I know where this is going.
So it turns out you really need a strategy guide for 10-2, and the reason for that is because Final Fantasy X-2 has a completion system.
Yep.
It has a percentage completion system that by talking to certain characters or finding certain items or seeing certain plot events, the percentage completed goes up. And to actually see the entire story of the game, you need 100%.
You gotta get 100%. You need 100%. Yes, you do.
And some of those percentages are really freaking obscure.
Hey, did you look at the security camera and talk to this random person in Chapter 3, but before you did this other mission in Chapter 3? Oh, you didn't? Guess you're doing that New Game Plus, son?
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, you did talk to that person, but you skipped through a cutscene? Well, doesn't count.
Yeah, so if you... Mason, so if you want to get the canonical ending in Final Fantasy X-2, you need to get 100% in this game, and that usually requires roughly about 3 playthroughs of this game in order to do, unless you follow a strategy guide to a T, Which
Yeah.
if you have the Brady Game Strategy Guide and it's not accurate...
So there's actually like missable events throughout the game?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of them.
And like Alex said, they're so obscure. It's like... And, like, it's not... Sometimes they're not even immediate payoffs. It's like you talk to somebody in Chapter 1 in order to complete something in Chapter 4. It's like the most Sierra Games adventure sort of like... It's like Police Quest. Oh, you didn't flash your badge first 30 minutes ago, therefore you failed. You got to start over.
Yeah. Except that this game is like 30 to 50 hours long and also has a difficulty curve problem. That was sort of part 2 of my experience, was getting like to the 3rd act of the game and then the monsters levels being like, how about you don't proceed?
That's where I just learned how to break the game and went Lady Luck Dress Sphere.
Yeah, that's fair.
The Dress Sphere that where you always critical hit and get double experience points.
Yeah, I don't know if I had that one. I don't know. My experience actually was playing this game twice. So I played it once without the strategy guide and realized again in the 3rd act that I missed a lot of the plot and also I'm underleveled. So I started it again, following the strategy guide to a T, which went well until I just got bored.
Yeah.
And then I stopped.
Sounds about right. So yeah, as you can see, a lot of mixed opinions about Final Fantasy X too, and I think we should maybe talk a little bit about its development before we get started.
Yeah.
So, following the success of Final Fantasy X, Square developed what was called the international version of this game. So this is something that Square does for some of their games. Final Fantasy VII had an international version. Kingdom Hearts had one as well, which was called Final Mix. And these are usually them just... Like, when these games end up going to, like, North America or Europe, they usually get additional things added onto because development times back then were so long, like the translation times and whatnot, that they could usually just add additional things. And then usually they'll compile those together, add a few new things, and release it back in Japan as what like Final Fantasy VII International or what have you. So the international version was sort of an expansion on the original, extra bosses and items, bug fixes and the like. But the big thing this game had, though, was a roughly 15-minute video that was tacked on called The Eternal Calm. This was meant to depict the aftermath of Yuna's journey and Sin's defeat. If y'all remember from the end of Final Fantasy X, Yuna defeats Sin. He's never going to come back anymore. Yu Yevon is killed. Tidus disappears forever. And Yuna is very sad. There isn't too much of interest in this video, but there are 3 things to take from it. First, about 2 years or so after the ending of Final Fantasy X, Yuna is living a quiet life on Besaid, trying to stay out of the limelight now that she's literally the most famous person in the world, and knowing that people probably are going to try to take advantage of that. This leads to the second part, which is, yes, people are. 2 new organizations called the Youth League and New Yevon are vying for power now. And the chairman of New Yevon, in what is an attempt at the most powerful flex ever, wants Yuna to marry his son. Which, boy, that just takes some balls. It's like, hey, we kind of declared you a heretic, and this entire religion you followed your entire life was a sham and just got your dad killed, and... all like your fun uncle became a monster. You want to marry my son? That would make it cool, right? And needless to say, she doesn't do this. And I'm literally only bringing this up because in Final Fantasy X too, there's a very confusing point where Yuna brings this up, and anybody who's never seen this, such as everybody in North America at the time of this game's release, it's very confusing. So I wanted to mention that. And the third and most important thing is that Riku shows up near the end. She shows up with her new team called the Gullwings, and they're Sphere Hunters. Spheres, I didn't really talk about them a whole lot in Final Fantasy X because they just weren't that relevant. But they're basically like magical VHS tapes, complete with like weird scan lines and everything, and like video artifacts. And these things have existed for thousands of years, and people are now finding these to dig up old information about Spira before Sin was around. And so the Gullwings are one of these teams that goes around to find these spheres. So they have found a very important one, though, that they showed to Waka and Yuna. and it reveals that there's a person on there who looks an awful lot like Tidus, trapped in a cage, waiting to see the summoner. Or wanting to see the summoner, I should say. This greatly upsets Yuna, who at first has no idea what to do, until Riku's like, hey, why don't you just join my band? We'll just go, man. Which Waka's like, hey, you can't do that. People here rely on you. Which Yuna goes, yeah, you're right, and then sneaks out during the night. So this whole thing was just to set up, essentially, Final Fantasy X-2. Or at least, if you look at this from, 20 years, well, a little less than 20 years now, in the future, that's exactly what it looks like. Square claims this is not the case. They say that they just wanted to show what life was like for Yuna afterwards, after everything was done. Ignore this sequel hook. So, this video and the overall reception of Final Fantasy X convinced Square that they had to do a sequel. They saw that people just really wanted to see what was going to happen with this Eternal Calm and hey, what's going on with Tidus, that they said, okay, you know what, let's go ahead and let's make a sequel. So supposedly starting a little after the release of Final Fantasy X International in January 2002, a lot of the staff from Final Fantasy X was brought back in. This includes the main director, Yoshinari Kitase, as well as main writers Kazushige Nojima, and Daisuke Watabe were both brought back in order to write this game. But the team itself was a lot lighter. It's only about a third the size of Final Fantasy X. And this game was only going to be in development for roughly about 12 months. It would end up being released in March of 2003. So a very quick turnaround time. And it kind of shows in this game. They reuse a lot of the assets, pretty much completely wholesale. I'd say about 90% of the game is stuff you've already seen in Final Fantasy X as far as pure graphical fidelity. And a lot of the stuff that is new are long corridors that are filled with boxes. It's kind of the most simple things you could possibly see. And this was something that was definitely reflected upon when this game was reviewed back in the day, that a lot of the new stuff just really didn't quite look nearly as good as the old stuff. So the game's tone itself was intended to be light and lively, which influenced the decision to have an all-female cast. All three of your main characters are female, which are Yuna, Riku, and a third woman named Pain, who we're going to definitely talk about. And have a story that was intentionally upbeat and centered around the idea of change. Change in Spira, change in Yuna's attitudes and way she looks at the world, and what have you, which we'll also get a little bit into that as well. So not everybody was a fan of this idea. And while, once again, the main writing team did bring back Nojima as one of the main writers, he personally didn't really like the happier ending that happens in this game, as well as just the happy tone in general. And he's going to do his best to turn that around once we talk about this novel later. But that's going to be for later. So once again, overall, this game had a much shorter development time, being released only 12 to 13 months after development again. But it was a pretty big success. It was the highest selling game in Japan in 2003, selling about 2 million copies. And in 9 months on the market, it sold 4 million copies worldwide. So it did really well. Critical reaction overall was favorable to the game, but fan reaction was pretty mixed. A lot of people were not big fans of how the game portrayed some of the characters. I remember the backlash against Yuna in particular was very strong. Because she went from being a somber priestess, wearing priest-like robes, to being a character who, I'm just going to flash the picture up here so Mace can see this and anybody viewing at home. Now all of a sudden you has the open shirt, has 2 guns, and got them booty shorts. And also, the world's longest ponytail. I don't know how that ponytail works, but it's there.
It's Spira magic.
Spira magic, exactly. The Fireflies made that ponytail for her. She just beckoned it into existence. I personally like a lot of the character development that Yuna goes through here. I do think her design is rather silly, but I just also think it's just kind of a bad design in general. The added sexuality, I kind of don't have an opinion one way or the other. Not like a lot of people did back in the day. I just think it just looks kind of silly. But yeah, portrayals of those characters and some of the dialogue that happens in there, it has a campier tone overall. People were weren't big fans of how some of these characters sounded, and like the musical choices and whatnot were meant to sort of invoke more of a Western influence, including like stuff like Charlie's Angels, like a lot of like Western pop culture, which a lot of people did not look on favorably. Personally, I love all the really silly touches they did with that, but I'm also just kind of a weird person about that. But yeah, that was more or less the development of it. And once again, like it sold very well. It didn't sell quite as well as Final Fantasy X, and I think overall this game is becoming more and more forgotten. I think people just don't really pay attention to this nearly as much as like it's not nearly as big of a deal, and I think a big reason for that is because there's just a lot more Final Fantasy sequels nowadays. Like it's not nearly as special as it used to be. I should mention before we go on, though, while this is the first Final Fantasy game sequel, it technically is not the first Final Fantasy sequel overall. There was an anime-only sequel to Final Fantasy V that's absolutely terrible, and I don't suggest you watch. That has maybe only the most tenuous connection to Final Fantasy V ever, but it technically does exist.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. Which is too bad. I love Final Fantasy V. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into the plot of Final Fantasy X-2.
Yes.
So, with the fall of Sin in Yevon, once again, a period called the Eternal Calm is ushered into Spira. With this, large-scale change begins to take hold in society. The Yevon religion more or less falls apart as we know it, both due to people rejecting Yevon as a bunch of lies, but also due to the faith's departure, the faith being the eternal living statues that could summon big giant monsters and whatnot. The faith's departure also leads to significant changes in the world, big and small. Eternally frozen lakes start to melt, magical woods start to wither and disappear, endless blizzards clear up, and just the world overall is just changing dramatically. So, I'm going to go over kind of like major things are happening in the world that are revealed during the game because there's just no real good place to do this. And it's just better to kind of know these things up front, I feel like. Yevon's fall leads to a major power vacuum, and different groups vie to fill the gap once occupied by the Yevon religious structure. On one hand, you have the Youth League. This is a group made up of former crusaders, those warrior monks that Yevon employed, and disaffected youth who want to reveal Spira's past no matter the cost. They're tired of the lies, they're tired of all the information being hidden, they just want it out there. On the other side, you have New Yevon, which, good branding on their part, made up of former church members but led by a young leader committed to openness and understanding, and wishing to keep the good of Yevon while ridding itself of the bad. However, while New Yevon wishes to share the information of the church with the people, they wish to do so in a controlled and slow manner, like one step at a time, which leads to clashes with the Youth League. Youth League wants it all at once. Yevon's like, yo, slow down. Let's just take it easy here. One's liberal, one's conservative, but like with a more centrist sort of view, if you want to frame it in modern terms, I suppose. Finally, you have a third faction called the Machine Faction. This is an Al Bhed organization that wishes to reintroduce Machina, now called Machines. If you remember, it used to be Machines called Machina. Now it's reversed. In order to change public perception and help the average Spirian in everyday life. They are perhaps the one faction that doesn't want all the power, and subsequently they're the one faction we're not going to talk about during this game. There's nothing going on with them. Finally, while the Al Bhed and the rest of Spira have settled their differences for the most part, tensions between the Guado and the Ronzo are reaching a boil. If you kind of remember, Seymour Guado, the main villain-ish from Final Fantasy X, committed a little bit of light genocide against the Ronzo off-screen. And the Ronzo are not happy about that. The Guado themselves have been exiled from their home for their support of Seymour, and they're awaiting their deaths in the slowly disappearing Macalania woods. And the Ronzo are ready to go on the warpath, ready to wipe the Guado from the face of Spira. I'm sure that a famous summoner is not going to stop that. And finally, on top of all of this are the Sphere Hunters, groups dedicated to finding ancient spheres that may reveal wondrous things about Spira's past. One such group are the Gullwings, made up of some familiar faces, which we'll soon meet in full. So that's kind of like the broad overview of how the world is at the start of Final Fantasy X-2. How the game actually starts is it starts in Lucca, the big city that has the Blitzball Stadium. And we see that Yuna's in the center of the stadium and she's surrounded by a bunch of people. It's dark, spotlight shines down on her, and then you hear the first opening notes of a pop song. Oh, yeah. Yuna then transforms into like a pop star outfit. You know, kind of think of like sort of like a Britney Spears sort of get up, but you know, like with like a nice like skirt or something like that. And gets a microphone, backup dancers, and starts singing. Now, everybody's going buck wild for this, but two women are also sneaking into the stadium at the same time, knocking out guards, and actually jump on stage to confront her. This is Riku and Pain, and they demand that Yuna give it back. Yuna refuses, there's a big fight, and they chase Yuna out of the stadium. They chase her down to the docks, and they corner her, but it turns out that this Yuna has led them into a trap. And it turns out she has a couple of like backup people, Ormi and Logos, who we're not going to talk about any further from here, but just know that they're very bumbling and not funny at all. So it looks like they're in a trap, but then all of a sudden gunshots ring out, and then a woman does a giant flip over everybody, jumps in front of this Yuna, and it turns out it's the real Yuna. And they all team up, and they all have like a big splash screen that has like psychedelic colors that says YRP. Because once again, this is incredibly Charlie's Angels. And so it turns out this person has stolen Yuna's garment grid, and she needs to give it back to Yuna, which she does. She willingly gives it back and transforms into this woman by the name of LeBlanc, who unfortunately I didn't grab a picture for, but she's a woman with short blonde hair. She's wearing kind of like a sexy outfit that has like that's like open in the middle, and she's a character archetype that is very prevalent in anime, kind of like the femme fatale who has like bumbling sidekicks and whatnot. If you want like an example in Western media, Jessie from Team Rocket in Pokemon is this particular archetype. So she gives it back to Yuna, and she's like, "All right, well now we're gonna beat you up," which doesn't go well for them because they're facing off against the Famous Guardian and the High Summoner, so they just get wiped. So this happens, and Yuna is transformed into that same pop star outfit, and she just suddenly starts to dance, and she's like scared about this, but eventually is like, "Oh man, this is actually kind of rad," and like starts laughing, and it's all really confusing. So this cuts back to a airship flying through the sky with maybe my favorite airship theme ever. That is very, very upbeat and sounds absolutely ridiculous. And we find out this ship's called the Celsius. And this is where the Gullwings, which Yuna is a part of, this is their home base. And we get to meet the rest of the Gullwings. So the Gullwings are a team made up of not only Yuna, Riku, and Pain, but are led by Riku's brother, who... Mason, you're going to love this naming convention, by the way. Riku's brother, would you like to guess what his name is?
Riku's brother?
Close. His name's Brother.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. His first mate is his best buddy. Do you want to know what his name is?
Buddy?
Yes.
All right.
So, Brother and Buddy, there's not much to say about them other than Brother is the comedy relief and Buddy is the straight man. Brother's comedy relief, though, is bad. His version of comedy relief is speaking in broken English and getting incredibly hot about Yuna constantly throughout the game. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Yuna and Riku are related. They are first cousins. This means that Yuna is a brother's first cousin. Brother needs to stop. And he never does throughout the game. It's awful. Now, there is a third member of this group, and his name is Shinra. He's a small little Albed kid whose name is a reference to Final Fantasy VII. A reference that actually led to a lot of confusion because he makes some very oblique references to Mako and other things in Final Fantasy VII, and the creators of Final Fantasy X had to come out and go, "No, these don't take place in the same universe. Stop it." But he's a little Albed kid who's clad in a yellow jumpsuit with a gas mask, which, keep that image in your head. That's gonna come back in a very relevant way in a very unexpected way in, say, 40 minutes. But he's basically like the MacGuffin of this game. He explains all the weird things that go on. And he explains that the reason why Yuna was dancing all crazy like is that the garment grid has stress spheres on it. These are spheres that contain like the essence and memories of whoever recorded it. And so those probably flowed through to Yuna because of strong emotions, and that's what caused her to dance and be happy. And this is going to be relevant. So what the Goldwings deal is, they're going and trying to find all these spheres all over the place, right? And they kind of do that a couple of times. They fight the LeBlanc Syndicate along the way. But one day they get a message about an awesome sphere that's being held in the temple in Kalika by New Yevon. So the Youth League wants to get that sphere to reveal to everybody. New Yevon wants to hold on to it. And Yuna and the team go, well, screw it, we'll just go and steal it. Which they do. They just go down and they steal the awesome sphere and whatnot, and completely upset the two factions, but they're like, whatever, what are they going to do to us? They don't have an airship. So it turns out there's a reason why New Yevon didn't want anybody to see the sphere, because they decode it and take a look at it. And on it, they see what looks like a giant elephant machina, and in front of it is a man who looks an awful lot like Tidus, and he looks up at it and addresses the machina and says, "You are all I can count on now to save Wen." This freaks out the team for varying reasons. Brother thinks the sphere is basically evil and feels like they need to give the sphere to one of the factions and just get as far away from it as possible. He's like, this is bad news. I don't want anything to do with this. Yuna is upset because she's now jealous. She's like, who the hell's Len? Who's this person? Is his former girlfriend? Why he didn't tell me about this? Like, what? I slept with this dude? Like, she is upset. And so she ends up having a nightmare where her and Tidus get gunned down in front of said giant machina. And that spurs her to also give away the sphere. She's like, let's just get rid of it. So this game has split paths that ultimately don't matter. They all lead to the same point. But you can choose to give it to either New Yevon or give it to the Youth League. Instead of telling you about all the minute differences that happens with that are ultimately irrelevant, we're instead going to take this time to actually talk about the leaders of both of these factions and kind of broach a little bit more about what their deal is, because this is when this would happen in the first place. So, once again, we have two factions, the Youth League and New Yevon. The Youth League is led by a man named Nuge. And Mason, get ready to see maybe one of the worst designed characters you'll ever see.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I forgot about Nuge.
Unfortunately, this model is not is kind of full on. It's you don't have a nice isometric view of it. The hair that's kind of going down in front of his face actually extends really far out.
Yeah, it looks like
he also had.
They were trying a bunch of different ideas and just couldn't decide what to go with.
They can't. Yeah, he has an all-red jumpsuit. For people who can't see this at home, all-red jumpsuit. One arm is fur. The other arm has a pauldron on it. He technically has a mechanical arm and a leg. He walks with a limp and a cane. And he's just all over the place. Like, his hair is all over the place. He has glasses on. Yeah, he's a mess. The character designer for this game was Tetsuya Nomura, who is known for some of the most iconic character designs in video game history, and also some of the worst. And this is easily one of his worst.
Yeah.
Thankfully, no other character really comes close to this. Maybe Riku. Riku is pretty bad. In fact, I'm going to flash what Riku looks like. I haven't showed y'all what Riku in Pain looks like. Riku's really is not that awful, but I'm not really sure what's going on with the scarf. And those are some pouches. And then, of course, we have Pain here, who...
This is just par for Nomura's course.
This is just Nomura being Nomura. There's belt buckles and chains everywhere, and what have you.
Black with red highlights.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Pain is wearing kind of like black spandex with black boots. Has a black sword with a skull on it. She's very goth. Silver hair that's short and kind of just has like weird suspenders that are red. It's a very interesting look. So yeah, Nuge is the leader of the Youth League, And as I mentioned here, he looks like the most anime and worst tendency of Tetsuya Nomura brought to life. We find out he's a very tough crusader who earned the name Deathseeker, which is hopefully self-explanatory. He basically tried to die, and he failed to. So after failing to die a whole lot, he instead founded the Youth League 1 year after Sin's defeat. He's incredibly charismatic and likes to refer to his soldiers as his friends, and is a big proponent of direct action. He believes it's important that people know about the Machina on the sphere so people can figure out a way to defeat it. He's going to have a little bit of ulterior motives with this, but that's his basic gist. Now, on the new Yevon side, we have Baralai, who actually looks a lot more put together overall, I would say. He is wearing kind of like olive robes that are a little bit open. He also has gray hair that's like kind of short and flipped up. And he is the leader of New Yevon, an organization that sprung up after the defeat of Sin and the fall of the Yevon Church. He was originally not the leader. He and a group of followers forced leadership, which were Old Guard priests, out of power and took over about a year after Sin's defeat. While largely agreeing to share Yevon's information with the people, once again he wants to release it slowly in a one step at a time approach. He wants to make sure that people don't see the sphere, so they don't freak out about the Machina's existence, and to prevent it from accidentally being awakened by the Youth League. Because he's worried that if somebody goes out and like disturbs it, it's going to wake up and destroy everything. Then there's Gipple. Gipple's leader of the Machine faction.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, he's kind of like a sort of ladies' man, but not really. He's also kind of... All the Al Bhed in this game are like comic relief in a really weird way.
Yeah.
He, we'll talk more a bit about Gipple's deal, but he doesn't really do a whole lot in this story, unfortunately. But once again, the Machine faction is building Machina and sending them out on the roads to protect people and just get people used to the idea of Machina in their everyday life. So once again, no matter who gets the sphere, we learned the Machina is called Vegnagun, built 1,000 years ago during the war between Bevel and Xanarkand. Whomever gets the sphere promises to stop Vegnagun, once again either ASAP or in due time, depending on the faction. The Gold Wings feel pretty satisfied by this. They leave and go, we did a good thing. But once they get back on the ship, they found it's been robbed by the LeBlanc Syndicate, who turns out they stole one half of the sphere that they collected earlier. And so they go, well, we need to go and get this back. So they steal a bunch of LeBlanc uniforms and sneak into the mansion, which is in Guadalajara, is actually Seymour's old mansion. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned how like a lot of the assets in this game are reused. All the assets in Seymour's mansion are reused, which means the banquet that was held for Unit 2 years ago, all that food is still out. Which, boy, it must really smell in that room. Or they're just filled with like the worst preservatives ever. Like it's like just Twinkies that are stacked up like a mile high or something like that. Just stuff that like, if you eat it, your body will never decompose.
I mean, you don't know what Guado eat. They could eat just raw preservatives.
That's true. I mean, it could be raw preservatives. It could be rocks. Maybe they're like Gorons from like Legend of Zelda.
Aren't they like plant horn people?
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. They look like living plants essentially that are also a little bit more humanoid. Yeah. You know, you're totally right. You know, it's probably just that. Seymour probably just like, I don't know what humans eat. You know, would you like this rock? It's shiny. I wouldn't put it past him. He doesn't seem to know much about human emotions. But
no. And clearly death is an alien concept to him as well, so...
Very true. Very true. His refusal to die is the absolute proof of that. So, they sneak in and they find this other half of the sphere. And, they find that, okay, LeBlanc Syndicate actually had the other half of this, and that's great. LeBlanc tries to fight them. They beat him up. And then they all decide to just sort of team up because they look on the sphere and they see that, hey, it's another image of Vegnagun. And they see that as in the Bevel underground. So New Yevon is still based in Bevel. So they realize that New Yevon's up to something. They already know where Vegnagun is. And so Yuna and the team up with LeBlanc to sneak into the Bevel underground and to see if they can't stop this Vegnagun before it becomes a problem. So they sneak into the inner sanctum of Bevel only to find that Baralai is already there. and he guesses correctly that they're there for one thing, to destroy Vegnagun. He warns them to leave him alone, because he's like, hey, listen, Vegnagun was designed that whenever it feels aminosity towards it, it will either fight or flee. And if you go towards that if you want to destroy it, bad things might happen. The team doesn't care. Yuna's like, no, we're going to go and do this. So Barrelite's okay. It's like, all right, well, I'm going to pull out the sword and stop you. It doesn't go well because it's a 3-on-1 fight. And once again, one of them's the High Summoner and a famous Guardian. And he's a priest. It doesn't end well. So they go into the inner sanctum and find that Vegnagun's already gone. But in its place is an Aeon. Now, the Aeons shouldn't be back. The Faith are gone. But this Aeon, which is now dark and corrupted, shows up. And Yuna is, like, absolutely distraught. Riku and Pain, like, jar her out of it. And they, like, we need to fight this before it kills us. And so they fight the Aeon. They manage to defeat it. And Yuna collapses and wonders how this could be happening. And she feels like the eternal calm is starting to come to an end. So before they can really reckon with what's going on here, Brother informs them there's another problem. Nuge and Barrelai have just gone missing, which Barrelai must have just, like, the second we beat him up, must have just, like, got up and just, like, limped out of there, like, at 100 miles per hour past everybody. Don't know how he managed it. But because of this, the factions are now leaderless, and they're at each other's throats. On top of that, fiends are now just starting to pour out of the temples for just no explainable reason. So the team decides that they're going to put sphere hunting on hold, and now they're going to become the friendly neighborhood goalwings. And they're going to now instead take contracts to defeat fiends and earn money that way. So they go to basically every temple, find that there's a corrupted Aeon there, and defeat the Aeon. When they go into the Chamber of the Faith, where the statues of the Faith should be, they instead find giant holes there. Holes so deep that even if you throw a comm sphere, basically a radio down there, it doesn't respond back. So it's like literally bottomless pits there. So they're really confused about all this and like wondering like what the heck is going on here. And while they manage to stop all the fiends, it doesn't stop the fact that the leaders of the major factions are still missing. So they do learn though that Gipple was spotted in Bevel. And sort of like, oh hey, okay, we should go track down Gipple. I bet you he knows where everybody is. And so they make their way back into the Bevel underground, and they sneak back to where Vegnagun was supposed to be. And they see all three of the leaders are standing in a triangle talking to each other. And so while they're down there, Barrelai confronts Nuge and asks him, he's like, hey, you come here to destroy Vegnagun? He's like, yeah, I came here earlier and it just ran away. So that's the reason why Vegnagun wasn't there in the first place. Barrelai tells him it's because Vegnagun, once again, can sense danger, but it can't determine friend or foe, which is why it was never activated in the first place. Like, the ancient Bavelians built this machine, and then it was like, oh, if you think bad thoughts at it, it doesn't matter if you're friend or foe, it just does things. I guess we shouldn't activate it. Boy, we made a mistake. So, they're talking about all this, and then Barrelai drops a bomb. He asks why did Nuge betray them? Specifically him, Gipple, and Pain. So Pain during this time has like, whenever she's run to like Nuge or Gipple or Barrelai, she's like just giving them dagger eyes. And has refused to like talk to the team why she was doing that. And like the entire team's like, oh man, old boyfriend, right? And she's like, I will stab you people. So it turns out that Nuge, Gipple, Barrelai, and Pain used to be a part of a team called the Crimson Squad. This was a group of elite crusaders whose job was to secure Vegnagun during the time of Sin. So they found out Sin existed, and they thought that they could find information about him in this place called the Den of Woe. So the entire Crimson Squad enters, and then they all immediately start going crazy and start shooting each other, and just having like weird visions, and just they start tripping. They start tripping balls. It's going crazy. The four people, Gipple, Pain, Nuge, and Barrelai, managed to barely escape with their lives. But the second they leave, Yevon starts tracking them down because they don't want the information about Vegnagun to get out. They manage to escape them, but as they're about to all part ways, they turn their backs to Nuge, and then Nuge just shoots them. Now, Nuge doesn't bother to check the bodies. He just kind of shoots them and goes, well, job done here. All right, I'm just going to walk on off. not going to check a pulse. I shot him in the arm. A feed will probably eat him. And turns out he's, I guess, just an incredibly bad shot. On top of being unable to die, he's unable to kill. It's quite crazy.
So he just shot all 3 of them, and they all lived.
Yep. Just shot all of them, and it was just like, job done.
Didn't even kill one of them successfully.
I mean, to be fair, as it's been proven in Final Fantasy X, it is sometimes hard to kill a person.
Yeah, this is true.
Everybody is just like a mini Rasputin, like walking around. You got to like kill them 4 different ways before they go away.
Yeah.
So Bearlight confronts him about this fact, and Nuge just tells him simply he was too weak to resist me. Which Bearlight's like, what are you talking about? But it's not as much of a surprise when a giant ball of light leaves Nuge's body and flows into Bearlight's. This causes Nuge to collapse, and Bearlight starts to speak now, noting that he found a mind that hates and despairs even more than Nuge's. So he's about to execute Nuge and Gipple when the Goldwings interrupt and a fight breaks out. And during the scuffle with now possessed Bearlight, he just escapes as well as everybody else. Another Aeon shows up. Yuna and the team fight him, but during the scuffle, Yuna is knocked into one of the giant holes and just falls forever. When she does wake up, though, she wakes up in the Far Plane. Now, the Far Plane, if you have forgotten, is basically the Sphere of Afterlife. It's basically where all the Fireflies go after they've been sent. And she wakes up in a field of flowers. So she wakes up already in her songstress dress sphere, so she has her pop star outfit on for some reason. And she looks up and she sees a man who looks an awful lot like Tidus, just like in the spheres she's seen. And it's this little buddy here. And so he looks at her and says, I finally have found you after all this time. And she's like really excited. She's like, oh, it's Tidus. This is great. And this man goes, it's me, Shuyin. And she's like, oh, damn. And Shuyin's like, I'm glad I found you, Len. And she's like, I'm not Len. He's like, no, you definitely are. I've been wandering for 1,000 years. I was trapped in this place, and then I escaped. And then as I wandered Sphera, I saw that it hasn't changed. People are still dying for nothing. And there is still hatred. But I'm going to solve this with Vegnagun. Shuyin's plan is basically the same as Seymour's. He sees that people are suffering, and he decides the way to solve suffering is by murdering everybody. So he's going to get this giant machina, and he's going to blow up the world. Which, if Bevel could make a machina that could destroy the world, you figure that'd be useful against Sin? I guess they only built one of them. It's really unfortunate that they decided to make it able to self-determine friend or foe.
Yeah. Seems an oversight.
Yeah. So Yuna wants to speak back to Shuyin, but she's just absolutely unable to. And Yuna just sort of collapses in front of him, and then Shuyin transforms back into Bearlight. So that's what that ball of light is. That ball of light was Shuyin, who first infected Nuge in the Den of Woe. And that's what convinced him to shoot all his team members. But now that Bearlight was so angry at Nuge, that ball of light flowed into him instead. So Bearlight, Shuyin, or whatever, creates a giant portal and just walks through it. Nuge and Gipple show up and are like, hey, Yuna, we're going to go deal with this problem. Don't worry about it. Tell Pain everything's going to be okay. And they jump through the portal. So Yuna is just super frustrated about this, and she just has no idea what's going on. She hears a faint whistle from a distance before collapsing and passing out and waking back up in the Bevel underground. So the Celsius picks her back up, and they tell her, hey, listen, the problem between the factions is now at a boiling point. They are literally holding knives at each other's throats. We need to do something about this. So Yuna or really more importantly, the entire team quickly realize that Yuna is the only person who can calm these people down. She's literally the most famous person in the world. She's the one who defeated Sin. So they decide, what if she holds a pop concert? And I think this is like the number one plot point that people look at. Okay, 1A to a 1B that we're going to get to later. That people look at and go, what? Because it seems like a very out of left field sort of moment. But Yuna sends out a bunch of invitations. They literally get a band, and they take everybody to this place called the Thunder Plains. A place where it is constantly thunder, but it's fine now. And Yuna gives a speech, tying in the events 1,000 years ago to the current situation as it is now. And Yuna begins her song, and her emotions are so powerful that images of Vegnagun and old Xanarkin are projected for everybody to see. Yuna also just straight up transforms into Len. We actually get our first actual visual of Len, who basically looks like Yuna but with long hair. And she also sees a vision of Len and Shuyan's final moments before they're gunned down. So afterwards, back on the ship, they're trying to make sense of what happened. Why did Yuna just transform into another woman? Why did all these images get projected? And then a literal MacGuffin shows up. And his name is Machin. Machin showed up in Final Fantasy X. He basically existed to tell you about Sphera's history. And we didn't really talk about him a whole lot because he was just kind of like flavor. He's kind of a cool guy to run into, but he literally just somehow ends up on the ship and is like, hey, do you want to know what their deal is? And everyone's like, yes, actually. How did you get here? And so he tells us about Shuyan and Len's deal. It turns out that Len was not only a pop star 1,000 years ago, but she was a summoner in Xanarkand. So that meant when the war happened with Bevelle, she was sent to the front lines. Shuyan, her lover from Xanarkand, who may or may not have been a blitzball player, decided that this was complete bull. He snuck into the Bevelle underground somehow. The idea of getting control of Vegnagun and using it to destroy Bevelle. I don't know how he managed to do this, but he did. What's even more confusing, though, is right before he's about to fire Vegnagun's main cannon, Len somehow also sneaks in and confronts Shuyan. It's like, hey, don't do this. And Shuyan, out of love for Len, hops down to embrace her, just in time for all the Bevelle guards to show up and gun him down. Now, as he lay dying, Len mouths to him, I love you, but Shuyan's unable to hear it. And so because of that, he is filled with rage. So, Shuyan's deal is that he's not an unsent. Unsent being people who, when they just really don't want to die, they just can maintain human form. He's something more akin to a shadow, which is how he's able to possess people. He's also able to possess multiple things at once. He was able to possess the faith somehow, because he's able to control fireflies. And that's how all the Aeons were able to come back. And since he could possess people as well, when they have strong emotions, that's how he possessed Nuge when he walked into the Den of Woe. Because Shuyan somehow got trapped there for 1,000 years. It's not really quite clear how. The game's very bad about explaining all this. And also, a lot of this is tied up in side content that you might never see. So, Yuna and the gang realize they're the only ones who could stop Shuyan, and they hatch a plan to do two things. They're going to jump into one of the faith holes, go through the portal, and confront Shuyan. Then, Yuna's going to transform into Len, just say, I love you, and then hopefully Shuyan will go away. So, they do this. They fight through to where Vegnagun now is, and they run into Nuge and Gipple. And Nuge is like, no, listen, I have an even better plan. I'm going to shoot Barrel Eye, and then when Shuyan possesses me, I'll just die. Which, given that it's been proven that Nuge can't die, given that he's been actively trying for his entire life, Yuna points out his plan sucks. In fact, that's her literal words. Your plan sucks. And she points out that this is literally what the entirety of Sphera was doing 1,000 years, was self-sacrifice and just dying for seemingly no reason. Yuna's like, our plan is better. We'll destroy Vegnagun. We'll basically send Shuyan. It'll be fine. So they go and they fight Vegnagun. And you would figure this would go very poorly for him since they're fighting a machine that's capable of destroying the entire world. But it turns out, no, Yuna's done this before. They defeat the Vegnagun. And Shuyan comes on down to see Yuna. And Yuna transforms into Len. and is like, hey, Shuyan, I love you. It's okay. You can rest. So Shuyan walks over to embrace Yuna, but he sees that it's not actually Lan. It's somebody else. So he gets angry, decides to attack. And this goes very poorly for him, because once again, nobody in this game can learn that you shouldn't take on these 3 people alone. This happens multiple times, and every single time they just like smack him over the top of the head. It's like, what are you doing? I'm the high summoner. So he gets on one knee, and he's angry, and he's like getting ready to get up and fight again, when all of a sudden, Len's spirit just leaves Yuna's body and embraces Shuyan. It's like, hey, listen, buddy, don't worry about it. I wrote a song for you. It's okay. She looks back at Yuna and goes, hey, thanks. Thanks for all this. I appreciate it. And then just leaves with Shuyan. And so that's Shuyan's deal. That's it. That's the story. They save the world once again. The ending is that they cut to the Blitzball Stadium in Luca, where Nuge, Gipple, and Barrelai are apologizing for all the trouble they've caused. They promise to work together for a new future, and they disband the Youth League and New Yevon, and promise to make a new giant super organization that's going to be super great. Yuna decides to skip the party, though, and instead, her and the Goldwings take off for new adventures. And in an ending that I personally like, they're basically Yuna's hanging on the dashboard, essentially, of this giant airship as they just like zoom through the clouds. And she's like, take us higher. This is rad. And she's like very comfortable now. Like, yeah, her boyfriend doesn't exist anymore, but she's going to live comfortably with the memories that she has of him. She's been able to explore the world and make new memories with friends. She's been able to meet new people and enact real change. And while Tidus may not be here anymore, he's in her heart, and that's all that matters. And that's the ending of Final Fantasy X too. Unless you get 100%. So,
yep, here we go.
So like that, I mean, that really does sound like a really nice ending. Like it's like, okay, yeah, you know, it's an upbeat ending. You don't get Tidus back, but who cares, right?
But then,
if you get 100%, and actually, you're going to really like this, Mason. It's not enough to get 100% in the game. You have to get 100%, and then when Yuna first meets Shuyan, you have to just randomly hit buttons while you're walking around waiting for Yuna to pass out that you're not given a prompt for at all, in order to hear a whistle and whistle back. And if you do that with 100% at the end of the game, right before everybody leaves like the far plane hole, one of the Faith show up to Yuna and goes, hey, real shame you didn't find your boyfriend. What if we just start dreaming your boyfriend back? Would you be cool with that? And you have the choice of saying no. Like, you could be like, hey, no, that's fine. You know, I've learned to move on. And, like, it changed the ending a little bit. Like, there's 2 seagulls that are now over the logo, and it's like, oh, that's kind of cute. Or you could say, hell yeah, bring back my dream boyfriend. And so if you do that, a scene that was at the end of the credits of Final Fantasy X happens, where Tidus wakes up at the bottom of the ocean, makes a stretch, and he swims up to the surface. When he rises to the surface, he finds he's right next to the Besaid Island, and he's like looking around, like all confused. And then all of a sudden, the Celsius like comes down and just buzzes him, and then Yuna jumps out and embraces him. And Tidus is like, "Hey, wow, this is crazy!" And Yuna's like, "Is it really you?" And it's like, "Yeah, it totally is." And then the entire island's population is on the beach, and they're like, hey, get a room, you two, ha ha ha. And they're like all celebrating, and it's great. And they run back up the beach, and they like see everybody, and it's like, oh man, I can't wait to tell you about the past 2 years. It's an awful ending. I hate it.
Yeah.
It's the most fan-fiction-y sort of like, well, we need to give them a happy ending. Why not? Let's just have everybody show up and then everybody's clapping and saying congratulations like it's Evangelion. Like, it's so strange. I understand why they did it. I personally don't like it, but for the longest time I was like, well, whatever, who cares? I'm not going to do anything else with this. So, Mason, what do you think about all that?
So I wonder if they were trying to hide that ending on purpose behind the 100% wall.
Yeah, I kind of wonder.
Maybe.
They were definitely trying to sell some strategy guides. I'll assure you of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's Final Fantasy X-2. A lot of people were very polarized on the ending. While I feel a lot of the story beats, like, I feel like Yuna's growth throughout the story is actually pretty well done overall. I think a lot of the fluff that surrounds it is admittedly kind of poor, and I do really hate that ending. But I did like the characterization of Yuna throughout it. And that's the reason why I will, like, defend Final Fantasy X-2's story at least a little bit. Even if ultimately it is a very flawed thing.
So, I'll agree with you. I like Yuna's characterization. I like that her character takes a direction other than where she was in the last game. That her character in the first game is very heavily predominated by, you have been born into the responsibility of dying for your people. And so her life has basically been to watch her father make this sacrifice for her people and then spend the rest of it knowing that she'd grow up to do the same. Mm-hmm. And so more than just like her actions, her entire personality is sort of defined by that melancholy.
Yeah.
And so once that weight has been lifted, it's interesting to see how does she redefine who she is. And I think it is interesting to see her not, remain the same person when she doesn't have to be weighed down by that same thing.
Yeah, totally. Like, the first game's big thing is that Yuna has no choice, and then she finally does make the choice for herself, and she chooses to reject everything.
Yeah.
And in the second game, like, the whole idea is about change, and I feel like they totally do accomplish that.
Yeah.
And like, a lot of people had, like, a lot of they like grumbled about that because, like, oh man, Yuna acts so differently, and it's like, well, it's been 2 years. She was 17, she's now 19. People change. That's how that works.
And also, the circumstances of her life are vastly different now. Mm-hmm. Like, they could not be more different in that it is going to continue.
Yeah. Yeah, when something major happens, after that thing has happened, you still have to live a life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also I like the foundation of this game's plot, mm-hmm. in that it's interesting that the biggest problem in the world has been solved, and people are trying to move forward while at the same time being sort of haunted by the memories of the past, particularly part of the past that the first game sort of touched on but didn't really explore. Mm-hmm. Which was like, sin was created by this war.
Yeah.
And there was like an incredibly unspeakable conflict, mm-hmm. fueling all that. And all we really dealt with was the aftermath. But this is sort of like, the ghost of the hatred of that war itself, fighting with, the hope and love and all those things, trying to move people forward.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of promise in that premise. The problem, and I find X-2 almost, or not even almost, I find it less interesting as its own game and less interesting as a sequel to Final Fantasy X than sort of for its place in the development of the franchise as a whole. Particularly in... it has its two writers, Nojima and Watanabe, who are returning from the first game. Kitase is returning as producer, but he's not on the writing this time.
Yeah.
And he's also, I believe he was director of the last game. He's not directing this one. X-2 is directed by one Toriyama Matomu.
Yes.
Who I'm looking at his Wikipedia.
Oh, he's the guy who really likes Lightning.
Yes. So this was, I believe, his first this was his first directorial role. He would go on to direct Revenant Wings, the DS sequel to Final Fantasy XII, before being put on 3 mainline Final Fantasy games, all of which include the number 13. I stand corrected. The third one actually... Oh, no, it does include 13.
Yeah. One day when if we ever talk about Final Fantasy 13, boy, we are going to be talking about Toriyama an awful lot.
Yeah, I imagine so. And so, suffice to say, for the purposes of Tin 2, I think the man has ideas and has problems executing those ideas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do agree with that. I also think that one of the main writers wasn't the world's most invested in this particular way of the story, and that'd be Kazushige Nojima.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And as we'll see when we talk a little bit about Final Fantasy X 2.5, he's going to make that very well known. So it's like, yeah, there's a lot of factors that went into this that like kind of ended up botching the execution. I mean, the fact that this game was very likely developed over 11 to 12 months, which is one of those things. When I first saw it, I was like, I don't think this is possible. Then I remembered Knights of the Old Republic, and I was like, actually, then again,
yeah,
like I bet you they wanted to actually develop this game sooner, but.
Mm-hmm. I'm also looking at Nojima's writing credits. And
we're going to talk about that in a second. It's going to be so good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
In fact, we should just kind of jump into that right now.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, this should have been the end of the Final Fantasy X series as a whole. After this, there was no plans to make any additional video game sequels. And they had, by that point, moved on to Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XII. And Final Fantasy XII itself would get its own sequels as well. And also be tied into another Final Fantasy game in a way that is kind of nuts in of itself. But it turns out that Square wasn't quite done. Now Square Enix wasn't quite done with all this. And particularly Kazushige Nojima wasn't either. In 2013, a novel was released by the name of Final Fantasy X 2.5 Ien no Daisho, which translates roughly to The Price of Eternity. Now, Nojima is on the record for not being a big fan of the happier tone of Final Fantasy X-2, and admittedly on the record, as a lot of people in the Japanese games industry are, like, very light criticism, which you could sometimes extrapolate to, like, oh no, they actually really hated this, to they actually didn't really care about it too much. Like, it's such a wide gamut, it's hard to actually read anything into it. But given the contents of this novel, I have the feeling that he just really, really hated where they went with that. So there's not really much to talk about the development of this novel, because it's a novel. But I am going to talk a little bit about the man himself, Kazushige Nojima. So Nojima's been around for a very long time. I actually didn't really realize it, because a lot of his writing credits that I was familiar with started with Final Fantasy 13. But it turns out he was actually in the industry as early as 1988, working with Data East. He was a scenario writer, which is essentially just like a script writer, more or less, on an RPG series that really wasn't worth talking about here. But he apparently did a good enough job that he was actually hired by Square in 1996 to direct the tactical RPG Bahamut Lagoon, a proto-Final Fantasy Tactics that is relatively well regarded. This is, as far as I know, his only directorial credit. His main passion was writing, and after this game, he was moved on to being a co-writer, a scenario writer for Final Fantasy VII, 8, and of course, 10. Now, he was the only writer on these games, as Square often had a collaborative focus when it came to this sort of thing, but at least for Final Fantasy X, it could be reasonably assumed he was the head writer or the closest they had to it. Now, Nojima has two main qualities to him. He loves world building and he loves writing romances. Both Final Fantasy VIII and X had romances be a focal point of the story. Now, world building was also his passion because he was also in charge of the lore for the Fabula Nova Crystallis, which was the entire lore that underpinned the story and scenario of Final Fantasy XIII, as well as the sequels and spin-offs. So, he was also more or less, like, he collaborated with the director, Katase, on Final Fantasy VIII, as far as, like, in Tetsuya Nomura, as far as, like, what to do with the story for Final Fantasy VIII, but he's also the only writing credit on there. Mm-hmm. And it's not surprising that game is kind of bonkers with the story, featuring time paradoxes and a romance that is kind of all over the place.
Also a ghost who possesses people.
Oh yeah, it also has a ghost that possesses people. Man likes his ghosts.
Yeah, sure does.
Final Fantasy 13 also had ghosts.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of ghosts in these writing credits.
Yep, ton of ghosts all over the place. So Nojima still works with Square. He's kind of done what a lot of industry veterans in Japan do, where they go to form their own companies that has only one employee, and then still gets employed by the same company to do everything for them. Something that Masahiro Sakurai has done wonderfully with Nintendo. Mm. It was fun to learn that Sora Limited had one employee. It's like, I see the scam. This is great.
Yep.
I love it.
No one can tell him to take time off if he's the only employee.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true. So yeah, so Nojima's a very interesting guy, and like, just to give you an idea of like some of the writing credits he has also had, he's also worked on Kingdom Hearts. Mm-hmm. He also wrote Final Fantasy 15. Like, he's very, very prolific, but there's also a lot of stories that some of the wilder tendencies in both of those franchises may have originated with him, as opposed to another person that it's often pinned on, Tetsuya Nomura. Mm. Now, Nomura is often known for having some incredibly crazy ideas and being on the record for them as well, particularly with Kingdom Hearts. But there's also a lot of good stories that floated around from the development of Final Fantasy VII, where Nojima would just suggest some insane idea, and Nomura would be like, actually, how about we don't do that? How about... I'm not sure about that.
Now, I do have to say, with regard to that subject, I don't see Nojima listed on Birth by Sleep's writing, so...
Yeah, no... If and when we ever talk about Kingdom Hearts, we will see what Nomura's writing style is, which...
Yeah.
His writing style is, if people think this isn't crazy enough, I escalate. Mm-hmm. He's a man who, if he were driving a car with me, he's doing 70, and you're like, please slow down. He's like, okay, pedal down.
Yep.
So yeah, this is the person who's going to be writing this book. Now, he's written 2 other novels, and they were both Final Fantasy VII novels that I have no knowledge of.
I don't either. I didn't know either of these existed.
I didn't either. But this book, before we jump into it, I do have to give a note about it. It's a confusing mess. Mm-hmm. This is both intentional and unintentional. Now, Nojima is on the record as having written this book as an open-ended sort of thing that was intentionally meant to be vague so fans could fill in blanks for themselves. When you break it down, it actually isn't that vague, but he wrote it in such a way that it was supposed to be. He wrote it separately into like 2 different sides, a boy's side, a girl's side, and then a boy and girl side. And he flips between time periods in a way that is incredibly confusing and erratic. The way we're going to be talking about the story is I'm going to just combine the 2 time periods together, and we're just going to approach one each. That way we can just kind of keep on top of this in a way that isn't absolutely confusing. The second thing is that this book was never translated to English. Rather, it was a fan translation. Now, that by itself wouldn't be that bad, but it's a second-hand translation because this book was officially translated for the French market, and then somebody translated the French version to English. Now, I do want to thank the people of the Final Fantasy X-3 forum for doing this. I do appreciate it, and we're going to be saying some things and ragging on them a little bit, but I don't want to be mean about it because they are amateurs about it. And translating is difficult. Translating is incredibly, incredibly hard.
Yes.
But they do lose a lot of the meaning when they do this. Like it almost feels like it's machine translated at certain points. And I had to reread a lot of these passages a couple times. I read this book 4 times. Read multiple synopsises, and these synopsises don't agree with each other. Because some of them will do it from directly a Japanese version, some directly from this version. And just the tone and nuance of some of these passages is kind of lost. Mm. It also has some weird translation quirks that are really some heavy, like, Nakama equals this, and we left this word in.
Right.
To give one example, since it was translated from French, there's a character who talks in a very formal manner. And there's no formal way to say they in our language.
Right.
So instead, they use the word vu. And it's literally points where this character will randomly say vu in the middle of their sentences. Which, honestly, if they left that alone, it would have been fine. Except they left a translation note saying, hey, this is the reason why we did this. It's like,
Right.
you didn't... But translation's hard. And I understand the choices they made. But this all leads to my main overarching point. I think I have a good idea of what this story is about, but there's a good chance I may get some facts wrong about this. I should have the overall gist of the story down, but if you do read other translations that tend to play at the more salacious side of this novel, it may not come across in this podcast as heavily. So, with that preamble out of the way, let's talk about this novel. So the story takes place right after Final Fantasy X-2, with Yuna and Tidus on the beach, and the Ewok celebration happens. And they go back to the village for a welcome party for Yuna by the locals, because Yuna's decided to live on the island now full time. She just sort of made that decision. So all the old people on this island are just taking up Yuna's time. They want to know what she's up to, what her plans are going to be, and all that. And Tidus is really jealous about this, because he just got back with his girlfriend, and now she's all distracted, and he's upset about this. So Tidus is a little bit jealous about this, but Tidus is kind of like in a weird spot right now. He's like consistently distracted in general, and like he has like lost all his strength. Like he plays blitzball later with the Besaid Aurochs, a team that's known for being terrible, and like he gets absolutely bodied by them. So he's just not with it. But during this party, like he meets up with Riku, and Riku basically explains everything that's happened. This includes telling Tidus about how the Faith just showed up and was like, hey, want your dream boyfriend back? And Tidus is like, oh, wow, so the Faith wished us back? That's great. And Riku's like, no, I think it's Yuna who did. I think Yuna just really wanted you back. This shouldn't be relevant, but it is. It's going to be a little bit, but we're going to circle back to that point.
Okay.
So Tidus once again is distracted by Yuna, and Yuna's like, hey, later, I'm busy, I'm talking to these old people. And Riku gets upset and storms off, which I didn't catch the first time I read this, literally. It seemed like Riku's like, thinks Tidus is being rude, and it just like doesn't come across in the translation. But Tidus is getting more and more frustrated about his inability to speak with Yuna, but he eventually calms himself down when he talks with Wakka and Lulu. Now, I didn't touch on this in Final Fantasy X-2 because it just wasn't relevant, but Wakka and Lulu, former Guardians, are now together, and they've had a kid. A kid by the name of Vidina, which is the Albed word for hope, because Wakka really wants to make up for that racism. And we learned that Tidus has a little bit of mommy issues and jealousy issues just in general, because, like, first, it starts with him turning around and staring directly at Lulu's breasts. That's literally just straight up written in there that he stares at Lulu's opulent breasts. So, great writing. And like, she has to go and take care of the kid. And he's like, he understands that, but he's like, oh, but stupid kid, why does he go and take care of her? And like, he has like, at the very start of the novel, he even like dreams about his mom. He's like, oh, I can't protect my mom. I just wish I could be with my mom. And it's like, and this is going to continue throughout the novel, where he just has these really weird mommy issues. It's really strange. So, Wakka and Tidus go down to the shore, and they basically play around with the Aurochs and dick around. And we learned that it's canon that the Aurochs actually won the Blitzball tournament in Final Fantasy X, because they have the trophy on a new training ship called the SS Ace. Now, down the docks, Tidus meets somebody new, and his name is Briar. He's an older man who was dispatched by Bevel to kind of keep an eye on things at Besaid and help out the temple there. Because, like, New Yevon doesn't exist, but, like, the Yevon church still kind of, like, sort of exists in a quasi-state, and so they're just trying to keep things propped up a little bit. So they have a very halting conversation where Briar just basically picks up on the fact that Tidus is not of this world. He knows that he's from Xanarkand 1,000 years ago. And Tidus is like, yeah, that's great. That's odd. And he refuses the answer because he's like, I know people here still believe an awful lot in Yevon. I don't want to commit weird blasphemy, create problems for Yuna. I'm just going to keep silent. So he leaves Briar, who we're going to come back to this guy, and joins up with Wakka. And Wakka explains that Yuna has come back to the island because she feels really bad about the temple and the old folks kind of losing their religion. And so she just wants to live on Besaid and help them out. And Tidus finds this incredibly annoying. He's like, why is Yuna doing this? She doesn't owe these people anything. He gets like very angry about this. So this is where, and this is the first really weird transition. We switch to another part of the island now, where a young man and woman are hanging out in a bungalow overlooking the beach. We learn that this man named Velm is in love with a woman there, a slender, elegant woman named Kush. She's the woman who likes to use Vu an awful lot in her casual conversation. They have a conversation when they notice a robed man emerge from the beach and roll a blitzball-looking object at them. Velm realizes that's a bomb and protects Kush from the explosion, saving her life. So, we technically are going to bounce back and forth between these two scenarios, but we're going to stick with this one because we're actually 1,000 years in the past now. We find out this was during the war between Zanarkand and Bavel, and we find out all these people are part of Bavel, and they've been occupying Besaid Island in his secret base. Velm and Kush are members of Bavel stationed on the island, with Kush being a summoner and Velm being her guardian. Now, I find this interesting because Zanarkand's associated with Guardians and Bavel's associated with Machina, but it turns out that no, Bavel had some summoners and whatnot, so that's kind of neat. We learn that he is desperately in love with Kush and wishes to be her Aeon Core. Faith don't really exist here, or they do, in a sense that you have to become an Aeon Core so a summoner can use you in battle. Of course, being an Aeon Core means you become a living statue, so it's not exactly it's a good fate, but still. So, Besaid is a base where the Bavelians are developing new robotic soldiers called Fake Bedor, which is apparently they're kind of terrible fighting robots that are clad in yellow jumpsuits with gas masks, kind of like that Shinra kid. So, they're called fake Bedors because they're based upon a real race of people called Bedor. Bedors are blonde people with green spiral eyes. They're basically Proto-Albed. And we also learned that these Proto-Albed, these Bedor, were given the green swirl in their eyes in order to make them easily identifiable. So they aren't being particularly subtle about what these people are supposed to do. They're a lower caste. You can make some references to other real world races and other sort of situations in our current era. So we learned that one of these people by the name of Alb is trying to build these fake Bedor, and they're just terrible. What's up?
Nothing. Please continue.
Oh, you already see where this is going, don't you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Final Fantasy X. It's not subtle. So, yeah, Alb is trying to build these, and Velm was like, hey, you need to really make sure these guys are good because we could be invaded at any moment. And, like, these fake Bedor are absolutely terrible at fighting. They are just the worst. And so they're like, well, hopefully maybe they'll get better. I don't know. So Kush is not the only summoner on this island. There's another summoner on this island by the name of Infernal.
What?
Or Infernal. It's Ifarnal. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be like Infernal. He's a muscular man with bright red hair who makes himself out to be a bit of a ladies' man. In fact, his introduction is him grabbing Kush just out of nowhere and giving her a deep kiss in front of Velm, which absolutely pisses off Velm. Like, Infernal is clearly into Kush and basically vows to make her his. So, some time passes and Velm is once again pressing Alp to finish the fake Bedor before they're attacked, but it's too late. Zanarkand launches a full-scale attack, and these robed people emerge out of the ocean and basically perform suicide bombing on the soldiers there. And so Velm is like desperate to find Kush and protect her. He's unable to find her in his quarters, but he does run into Infernal, who's like, hey, no, I know where she is. Follow me. And they go back to Infernal's quarters, where they find Kush dazed and half naked. So the implication is obvious, and Velm punches out Infernal. Now, the one fake Bedor comes in and like restrains him, and like Infernal's like, hey, let him go. But then another fake Bedor walks in and just with a gun and just shoots Velm dead. And as Velm lays dying, he realizes that Al probably sabotaged them and made them turn on the Bavelians. He's most likely a traitor, and this fills him with anger towards the Bedor. Just so much anger. So he's able to get a few words out, and he asks Kush to send him before he becomes a fiend. And Kush is just in shock. She's like, oh God, he's dead. And so she doesn't do that. So Velm is convinced that Kush hates him and wishes to send him to hell. And then Velm dies. So we come back to the present day to find that not only Yuna has gone missing, but a major storm is about to hit Besaid Island that very night. So Tidus decides to set off in the Ace to look for her, while the Goldwings, who are up in the air in the Celsius, try to warn Besaid about the storm. However, they find their radios destroyed. Like, it just doesn't work anymore. And on top of that, the Celsius, all of a sudden stops working, and they have to land on Bevel and are stranded. So Tidus is on the Ace, and he's trying to figure out how to, work the boat, but then he gets frustrated and takes a nap. But while he takes this nap, the boat ends up going out to sea, and he wakes up and he finds out that Yuna is captaining the boat. And she's wearing a robe, and she basically decides that she wanted to take Tidus out in the water so they can basically just get away from everybody and just have sex on the ocean. Which is exactly what they do. And Tidus is like, this is pretty rad. So Tidus asks Yuna why she's bothering to stay on Besaid, and she more or less repeats to him what Waka told him, that she feels guilty about abandoning the people of the island and robbing the elderly of not only literally every one of their spiritual support, but just their entire worldview. And so she feels like she owes an obligation to these people who helped raise her. So Tidus thinks that what Yuna did was a good thing, destroying the religion and everything like that, and she shouldn't feel obligated to help anyone. Yuna really disagrees with this, and they have a huge argument over it. These arguments are going to happen incredibly frequently throughout this novel, and we're not going to go over every detail, but basically it makes Yuna think of Tidus as a child. She directly references him as a child, and she knows that he's still technically 17 because he's been gone for 2 years, and she's 19. They're living two different lives at this point, which I'm I guess. And a 17-year-old is very different from a 19-year-old nowadays, but that world's sort of different. It's more complicated. The point being is that she's this dude is a kid, and I don't know what's going on with this. So they make up, but the storm hits, and it causes the ship to break apart, and they end up stranded on what appears to be Besaid Island. So while they wake up and explore the beach, they find out that there's a bunch of strange statues everywhere. Besaid has a bunch of old ruins that are now all of a sudden complete, and so they're really confused about what's going on here. Tidus thinks they might have gone back 1,000 years in the past, and Yuna's like, hey, how can you be sure about that? And Tidus is like, well, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure. He's deep down, I'm pretty sure. And Yuna rolls her eyes at this and is like, this is stupid. You have no proof about this. They get back to the beach, and after exploring the forest and the ruins and whatnot, and Tidus attempts to get a little frisky with Yuna, who's really just not having it right now, and begs him off and says that somebody in the tower might see us. Tidus is a little frustrated about this, but he kind of gets over it quickly. And he sees a blitzball on the ground. He's like, blitzball, this is great. He runs over and picks it up, only to be like, wait, this isn't a blitzball. And it's not. It's one of the bombs. And it blows up. And Tidus' head lands in Yuna's lap, which freaks Yuna out, and she passes out. So Tidus is dead. Yay! It's okay. He was a ghost. So Yuna has a very confusing dream. It's very hard to describe exactly how this dream goes, because even how it's written and even the synopsis in it is just very odd. Just to quote directly from the synopsis, she is sad her feelings cannot be fulfilled. She meets a god, and she is sad her feelings cannot be fulfilled, but the god tells her he will cast a spell that will suppress those feelings up until the day she became a summoner, but not erase them, with the possibility of them returning if something were to trigger them. Because she tells this god about Tidus and how she fell in love with him because he was an ordinary boy, which is not true, whom she met the day she became a summoner and whom she fell in love with during her pilgrimage. Which is that dude was a blitzball star and was completely nuts. That man was not normal. But the point is that he's like, hey, yeah, I'm going to suppress this ability, but, you could break it back at any time. And so she wakes up in a temple that seems like it's Besaid temple, and Tidus is there. And so it's like, it's really, really confusing. But they explore the temple now, and they find statues that explain the gods of the old. So it turns out ancient Bavel had more or less the polytheistic religion. It's kind of similar to like Greek mythology. And they find that these names of these gods include Cush, Velm, Sloam, Arb, Infernal, I think Lenore is another one, and so on. So it turns out those people we saw in the past were named after these gods for one reason or another. They don't know what to make of this, other than they must indeed be in the past, and they leave the temple only to run to a frail old woman who addresses herself as Cush. By the way, the fact that she's named Cush, I'm a child.
Yeah.
And I don't think I need to explain any further.
Nope.
She explains who summoners are, what summoners are, which Yuna's like, yeah, I know what that is. And she asks Yuna and Titus to name what the brightest star in the sky is. So they both get it wrong. Because this is like a random question. Like, they both have different answers to this. And she tells them that the name of it is the Eye of Henri before disappearing. So Yuna realizes that they aren't in the past because of this. But they're in a different world altogether. So Titus and Yuna then immediately sense the presence of another summoner, and like Titus is like, hey Yuna, you need to run. But before they could do that, Yuna gets a vision of Cush and Velm in a forest. And she's told by this other summoner voice that if she wishes to return home with Titus, she has to find Cush and kill her. So back on Besaid, everyone's in a commotion trying to find Yuna and Titus, when Lulu confronts Briar. Remember Briar? And just sort of wants to know what his deal is. So Briar tells her he just works for the temple. But Lulu mentions stories of people witnessing others being transformed into fiends near the temple at night, all while shouting his name. Which is not foreshadowed at all. He tells her that she misheard it, but he knows it's true. He apparently has been doing this. He's been transforming the priests at the temple into fiends for one reason or another. So he goes back to the Besaid temple and he runs to the Gold Wings. And he sees the three Al Bhed members, including Shinra, and he freaks out when he sees Shinra, because he's clad in a yellow jumpsuit with a gas mask, and he asks what this Bador is doing here, and it tries to attack him. Once again, not learning the lesson of Shuyin, Baralai, Seymour, and a lot of other people. You don't attack a group of people if you're by yourself, and he gets immediately subdued. And so the Gold Wings tie him up, and he immediately has a dream. And he remembers his past. He remembers how he washed up in the shore of Spira one day and wandered into a bar. He met a woman there, and he asked what the name of the brightest star in the sky is. She responded with the Nightberry, and he's like, no, you're wrong, it's the Eye of Henri. Which she really liked that name, and she renamed the bar that. So she also liked Briar an awful lot, and they eventually married. So this woman's name was Mero. And they were together for a while when all of a sudden, like, a priest of, like, Yevon came along, saw the name of this bar, and was like, oh, we gotta arrest this woman. And they did, because this is information from the before times. She knows about the ancient name of the star. So she's tortured, but she never gives up the name of Briar, and she unfortunately dies. Because they want to know, like, where she got this information from. So a priest friend of the two comes back and gives Briar a baby and says, hey, this was Mero's child. I'm guessing it's probably yours. And so Briar decides to name his child Lenore after one of the ancient gods, which the priest is like, you shouldn't do that. That's a bad idea. Did you not learn something here? And so he's like, all right, I'm going to name her Moria instead. So Moria grows up and is about to get married when an old friend of Mero's shows up at the wedding, completely blitzed out of his mind, drunk, and accuses Briar of getting Mero killed, which is accurate. He also notes that Briar never ages. Like, Briar, like, would, like, shave or grow out his beard at random times to make it seem like there was a change in his appearance and aging, but he knows that he isn't aging at all. And so Briar's so embarrassed by this fact that he just chooses to leave and cut ties with his family forever. And then Briar realizes that he's been repeating this over and over. He's been going to the Church of Bavel, becoming a priest for them. Then he would lose his memories and then, like, regain them at some point, remember all this, and just this would keep happening to him over and over. And he realizes who he truly is. He's Velm, the guardian of Cush. Which I wish I was the guardian of Kush. That would be that'd be my good like white rapper mid-90s like sort of moniker. I would get a lot of airplay and probably have a really bad scandal later on in life. But like a really boring one.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say it wouldn't be that good a scandal.
No, it wouldn't. It'd be like minor tax evasion or something like I'd grift somebody.
And everyone would be like, yeah, he did that.
Yeah, of course he did. Of course the dumb asshole white boy who's like, I'm the guardian of Kush. I love grifters. Anyways, so yeah, Velma is interrogated by Shinra, and because Shinra's like, hey, why'd you call me this Bador? And so he explains this, that he tells him about the oranges of Albed. He's like, well, I guess Albed are called that because they are Alb's creations, which is meant because Alb looked over the Bador, and so those got combined and they were called the Albed. He's like, they probably did that so they could just make fun of the Albed, which Shinra's like, that doesn't make sense, but okay. So we learned that like technology in general is just sort of breaking down, like all the Machina are breaking down, and that's because the Albed, while they're good at fixing up Machina, they don't know how to make it. And so they don't know how to repair anything, which is patently false.
Wait, what?
Yeah, because Shinra's like, I don't know how to repair the Celsius. And it's like, but you literally once dredged up an airship from the bottom of the ocean that was on there down there for 1,000 years. What do you mean?
But they can fix things, but they can't make them, so they can't repair. That's what fixing is. Right?
Yeah, it makes zero sense. It makes zero sense, but that's their justification for all the technology destroying and going back to a more Final Fantasy X sort of like origin and era. You know, almost like we're trying to get back to like square one? Almost? I don't know. I'm just speculating. So, he says with foreknowledge. Mm-hmm. So, Velm.
Oh my god.
Right? It's so terrible. Like, everybody talks about, like, Tidus acting like a child and really wanting to constantly have sex with Yuna, and they talk about all that, but they don't talk about this point. So Briar's like, hey, listen, or Velm says like, hey, I can fix Celsius, and Shinra's like, no, you can't. You're not a Bador. He's like, no, I know how to. Don't worry about it. Just untie me. I'll do it. And Shinra's a dumb kid, so he does, and he just gets kicked in the stomach and gets knocked out. And then Velm's like, all right, I need to find Kush and kill her, because I'm about to disappear. And he knows that he only has a limited amount of time before he disappears, which is not how Unsent work, but we're going to get into why that is in a bit. So we go back to the other world where Yuna kind of just walks off without Tidus because she kind of needs space from him at this point. She's just kind of tired of him. She's like, man, he's kind of like a clingy guy. He'll just basically do anything I tell him to. He's kind of like a puppy dog. Like, she literally says a line, so like, he acts like a child because I know if I say something is bothering me, he'll just try to go ahead and solve it, and I just don't want that. Which is actually kind of cut a little bit for me. It's like, I've done that in my life. But
also, he should be dead. That doesn't bug her at all.
Yeah, it really. Yeah, you would think maybe she just chalked that up to a weird dream, having his head in her lap.
Yeah.
But yeah, she walks off, and like Tidus is like worried and by himself, and then all of a sudden, Kush walks up to him and is like, "Hey, listen. You need to find me and kill me. If you do that, then we'll be able to get you and Yuna back to your world." And Tidus is like, "Well, I can't leave. How am I supposed to do that?" And she's like, "Don't worry. I'm going to give you an ability where if you just imagine a place and just start running, you'll end up there." Which Tidus promptly does. He thinks of Besaid and he runs to it, and he ends up in Besaid. It's great. So yeah, isn't that's awesome?
Okay, so which Besaid?
Regular Besaid.
I don't know which Besaid that is anymore.
Besaid, the one that has Waka.
Okay.
So, Yuna is like now by herself and whatnot, and all of a sudden she just finds herself on a rusty boat Like, she just gets transported to a rusty boat. Because, yeah, Kush meets up with Yuna again. She makes her a deal that she'll bring her to Infernal, provided that Yuna does not send her to the far plane before shining brightly and dispersing into fireflies. Right, there we go. Had to remind myself of that little part. So, because of that, Yuna ends up on a rusty boat, and there's a skinny old man with long white hair who reveals himself to be Infernal, but he's now known as his real name, Joit. So, how these weird names are working is that when you're a big, high-up person in the Bevel hierarchy, you take on the name of a god. And then when you die, you pass on that name to somebody else. Why? I'm not sure, because it's really weird, because Bevel was never really shown to be much of a spiritual society before, the whole thing happens with Sin.
Right.
Like, that was their whole defining thing, is that, Xanarkin's spiritual, Bevel's mechanical.
Right.
So it's kind of an odd point, and it seems like it only exists just to confuse the reader. I don't know why they bothered with this, but...
I also feel like maybe they could have flipped Xanarkin and Bevel in these roles, and it would have been fine.
It absolutely would have been. It would have made perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah, oh god, it would have made 100% more sense.
Yeah, it would have solved a whole lot of this problem.
Yeah, it would have. Why didn't they do that? So,
why is the summoner working for Bevel?
Well, I mean, it sort of makes sense.
That's fundamentally wrong.
It sort of makes sense. I'm okay with the idea that there's some summoners that exist in Bevel. Like,
sure, but who cares also?
Yeah. It would be cleaner if you kept them separate. It certainly would be. But, so Yuna meets this man, and he explains to her that he's he's no longer the beautiful man that he once was. And he gave up his name of Infernal because that's the god of beauty. And he's like, I'm no longer appropriate for that name. So he tells her about the faith, why they existed and whatnot. And he explains that, in Xanarkin, the faith were created by Yunalesca. Yunalesca just always had that ability to create faith.
Sure.
And that's how Xanarkin did it. But Bevel, they had to do it a different way. And there was many different ways they had to do it. And for one reason or another, he just sort of shows Yuna basically pornography. He shows them, how the method he developed to create an Aeon core, which is, it's sex, it's fucking.
And now I know why these are Bevel summoners in this story.
Yep.
Okay.
There you go, you got it. So, Yuna blushes at that, and Infernal's like, well, this is just one way. You can technically do a bunch of other ways, but this is what I developed. He's like, there's easier ways to do this. But he's like, you need to have a strong emotional connection. So he's like, it makes sense that you would do this. It makes sense since sex is a very emotional act. Sure, okay, I guess. I feel like you didn't have to go this route, but whatever. So, yeah, the Summoner and Faith must share a mutual sympathy to summon an Aeon, something which Joit says he was not able to do adequately. He explains the island, though, that they were on was summoned by him, created with an uncountable number of faith. So he basically did a Yui Evan.
Right.
And so Infernal's like, hey, you want to meet the Faith? And Yuna's like, no. But he's like, no, I insist, you should. And so they go down to the hold, and they see basically a bunch of dead bodies. Like Bador that were on the island, and for some reason, a chocobo. And he goes yeah, we were all escaped the island, but there are too many enemies. And so we came back to the island, and that's when I hatched the plans. I'll turn all these people to a faith, we'll create an island, and we'll just go there and just live there for 1,000 years. So Infernal is an unsent, basically. And they're talking about all this and kind of explaining what's going on. And, Yuna is like, hey, I kind of just want to get back to where I'm from and whatnot. And Yuna's like, hey, is the boat real? He's like, yeah, no, it's real. He's like, I stopped the summoning because I ran out of faith. The power of the faith ran out. The island no longer exists. So fake another world Besaid doesn't exist anymore. So Yuna realizes, okay, I'm back to where I need to be and I can get back to Besaid. Now, before they can talk any further, a mass of fireflies gathers and forms Velm. And Yuna's like, oh, wait, you're Briar. And he's like, yep, I got a problem with this guy. So Joy and Briar, like, know each other. Because they are, of course, Infernal and Velm in the past. And they argue about how Infernal betrayed Velm by taking Kush and making her an Aeon Core. So that's the whole reason why Infernal had sex with Kush. It gets even deeper because, like, Infernal explains, is like, no, listen, Kush didn't want you to become an Aeon Core because she wanted you to just live your life. She loved you so much. She just wanted you to do whatever you wanted. So she came to me and offered herself to me. And Velm's like, that sounds like a lot of bull, man. And he rolls a bomb at him. He's like, guess what? I got this bomb. I'm going to kill you.
Why does he have all these bombs?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know how he pyreflied himself there, and I don't know how he somehow managed to have a bomb.
Is the bomb real? Is the bomb pyreflies?
Oh, no, the bomb is very much real because he messes up, and the bomb gets kicked back to him, and it blows him up.
Oh.
Yeah.
They should really stop making such kickable bombs.
Yeah, they
Seems like a mistake.
Yeah, they really, really should. Yeah, they really, really should. So, yeah, as Briar Velm begins to die, whatnot, like he realized he isn't actually unsent. He was beckoned here by Kush. Kush just wanted Velm to come back so badly, he manifested himself back. Remember that part earlier where Riku's like, hey, I think just Yuna wanted you back so badly?
Right.
This is a very big retcon. Because Yuna realizes this. The Faith didn't bring Tidus back, even though they said that they were going to. She brought him back.
Right.
Yeah. Now, this is a little confusing. It may not be a complete retcon. It could be possible that they did, and that when Tidus died the second time, Yuna brought him back then. That is also possible, and so this isn't a complete retcon. But let's just say it's going to set up things for the future. Yeah, apparently if you just really want somebody to be back, if your cat dies and you want that cat back, you can bring it back.
Okay.
So, basically, Joy Infernal, like, he ends up, like, fading away after this. And Yuna is like, now just stuck on a boat. She's like, oh, this is a bit of a problem. So Tidus is back in the village, and he's like, everyone's questioning him, was like, hey, where's Yuna? And he's like, I don't know, and I don't know how to get to her. And then he remembers, oh, wait, I could just imagine her and then run to her, which he does. And then he runs into Yuna.
Okay.
And so Yuna's like, hey, how'd you do that? He's like, no time to explain. We gotta find Kush. I was told to kill her. And so he grabs Yuna, and then he imagines where Kush is, and he ended up running into a woman who's just sitting in a chair peacefully, an old woman, doesn't acknowledge their presence. And so they're like, oh, this must be Kush. And then Velm shows up again. Because once again, dying is hard. So, Velm shows up again. He's like, oh, here's where Kush has been this entire time. And Tidus is like, oh, yeah. Kind of crazy, huh? He's like, yeah. He's like, I'm really happy I'm reunited with Kush. I feel like I can now pass on. And he thanks Tidus and Yuna for that. And like, oh, don't you really care about Kush? He's like, no. I end up having a wife and kid. I kind of care about them more. Kind of really just want to see them now. And this was just puppy love. This wasn't actually anything. Which is like, that's harsh. She's right there, man. And so they're like, well, how do we kill Kush? And he's like, just give her a shove. So they do. And she just blows up into fireflies.
Wait, why do we have to kill Kush? I'm confused about that.
Well, they have to kill Kush in order to get back to Besaid.
Why?
That's a good question, because they're already back at Besaid.
And couldn't he just think of it and start running?
Yeah, they imagine how to run back there, so who cares, right?
Also, wasn't Kush the one who gave him the power to do that?
Oh, yeah, and now that Kush is dead, Tidus can't do it anymore.
Why did Kush want them to kill Kush?
I think Kush just wanted everybody to rest.
Oh.
I think.
But they couldn't do that without Kush dying?
No, and this is sort of explained here in a second, I think.
Okay.
Once again, this book is incredibly confusing because Tidus and Yuna then travel to Xanarkand by foot because all the airships are not flying, all technology is not working anymore. And they stand on the spot where they had the bonfire, the opening scene in Final Fantasy X.
Yep.
And Yuna asks Tidus if he's a real or not just a dream. And Tidus is like, boy, I hope's not. Yuna, though, knows that she beckoned him after the Oh, yeah, so this is true. After the incident on the island.
Mm.
So, okay, so it's not a complete retcon. And she realizes that if Tidus knows this, he'll disappear. Because that's what occurred when Briar realized he was beckoned via Kush's feelings. So that's the reason why Kush wanted to be destroyed, or at least wanted, like, to conjure up a situation where Briar was going to end up near Kush. That way, Kush could Briar could realize what was going on. He could disappear and rest, because she failed to do that for him 1,000 years ago. That's my interpretation, anyways.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah,
I get
it's bad. Yeah. So, oh yeah, and this is the Wikipedia entry that has the reception tab that says this novella has been received negatively by many Japanese fans. That is the only line.
Okay, so here's my takeaway from this whole thing. There were some parts about Final Fantasy X, specifically pertaining the faith and the dream of the faith, and Xanarkand that was, and the ruins of Xanarkand, and Tidus is alive, is dead, is a dream, is a real boy, that they never hit as plot points like they were supposed to, because I couldn't understand what was happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like I now understand why that is better, because I feel strongly like Nojima I feel like the mechanics of this, of the faith and the dream and the fireflies, is something that probably Nojima came up with, and he has a very strong internal idea of how it works.
Yeah.
But he's not very good at communicating it through storytelling.
The man is a guy who writes worlds. And I think he does a very good job with that, but when you ask him to do more than that, that's when it falls apart.
Right. Well, and I think there's also, he maybe, obviously I can't say for sure, but the impression I get is that there are times he struggles to convey the details of the world that he has written. Specifically details that are very important for the audience to understand what's happening. And so you get things like this where I think what's actually happening here is he is extrapolating the rules he created for the faith and the dream to say, like, well, if this is the way that it worked, then it could also work in this way. But you didn't properly explain that foundation to begin with, and then everything you're building on top of that seems like an insane nonsense dream.
Yeah, totally. And there's also the other part where, like, there are established rules of consequence, right? Like,
right.
If you die, you die. Except in Final Fantasy X, it's like, unless you have really strong feelings, in which case you could be, like, an unsent.
Right.
Unless somebody really just wants you to come back, and then you can be beckoned.
Right.
Except, and like, it keeps going, there's constant exceptions.
Right. And like,
so,
they aren't hardcore contradictions.
They are, but it's an added complexity that just keeps getting more and more complex.
Yeah. Which, oh boy, I'm remembering that he has Kingdom Hearts writing credits.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And admittedly, I think a lot of that is going to actually be Nomura, but...
Fair, but I'm also remembering, if your heart is lost to the darkness, your mind and body become a nobody. Okay, well,
but your body, your heart becomes a heartless, and your body becomes a nobody.
Yeah, which yes, the terminology's backwards, but also the moment they go, well, whose nominee's nobody? Kyrie's. How does that work?
Oh, I just want to talk about Kingdom Hearts for 3 hours. You want to talk about Kingdom Hearts for 3 hours?
At some point, yes. At some point, I desperately do.
Mason, you're confused by this. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, I'm incredibly confused.
Do you want to be confused with Disney characters added on top of it?
Yeah, sounds good. It's yet another series that I've never played.
Oh, fantastic! One day. Go ahead.
I don't want to talk forever about Kingdom Hearts, but I want to say that the first 3 games, which is 1, Chain of Memories, and 2, are standing on the precipice of this nonsense of compounding complexities and obscure mechanics of a universe that makes sense in someone's head.
Yeah.
But needs to at some point be translated to everyone else's head, and things get quickly lost in more and more translation issues. And then, you have Nomura and Nojima both sort of driving the train forward faster and faster. And I assume probably also Square Enix going, hey, those games make a lot of money, make more. To which they both go, can do. I've got this great idea for the Noid. The hell are the things in Birth by Sleep even called? I don't remember. The point is they're not heartless, except they are, but they're not.
Yeah, they manifest feelings, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, Kingdom Hearts, once again, we're not going to dwell on this too long, because it's not a Kingdom Hearts podcast, but, like, Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy X share one thing where they actually have, the first game has a very cohesive story that's actually pretty easy to understand.
Yes.
Like, Kingdom Hearts is not that complicated.
No.
But then they make sequels, and then they have to add on, and then things get contradictory and get weird and go
6
off the
games
rails.
and 1 Tamagotchi system in, you're like, wait.
Yeah, because you were supposed to stop at some point, but nobody ever did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this guy's alive again. Of course.
Yeah, of course. Of course Tease is alive again. Yeah, so that's should have been it. This came out in 2013. It wasn't well received, and you didn't hear a peep about Final Fantasy X at all after that. And that should have been it, but it wasn't. Because in Final Fantasy 2016, that's the new year convention that we have now. It's just we go by Final Fantasies. But it's kind of like how the Star Wars timeline is just when does A New Hope take place?
Yeah, who knows?
But in 2016, the Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X-2 HD remaster came out. Pretty cool little thing. I actually bought it recently, and then immediately went, I don't have time for a 60-hour RPG. Why did I pay this money? But on it came something else. There was something called Final Fantasy X Will. Final Fantasy X Will is an audio drama that is written by Kazushige Nojima for Final Fantasy X 10-2 HD Remaster. And it's set 1 year after the events of Final Fantasy II. X-2. And it centers around 2 new characters by the name of Chiwami and Kurgum. And this is something that's about 30 minutes long, and you can actually find it on YouTube. And it's bad. It's completely voice acted. The original voice actors came back to do this. You could not only find it on YouTube, but you can also listen to it directly in-game if you wanted to. And this... I feel like they were trying to set up a sequel.
I wish they'd stop.
I wish they would stop too. And I feel like that this does not contradict a single thing that happened in the novel, and in fact it builds off of elements from the novel. Yes.
See, again, I feel like Nojima has this very strong internal idea of how all this works, and all this makes sense to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tries to explain it to anyone else, and they go, either what or That's dumb.
Oh, I think it's a little bit more insidious than that. I think he literally just did not like Final Fantasy X
Well,
too.
yes, also that.
Yeah, he's trying to get back to a base. And
Yeah.
once we get through this plot, which is not going to take long, it's a 30-minute audio drama. God help me if I take more than 10 minutes to do this. But as we're going to find, that may be what he has been trying to accomplish this entire time. So, a brief mention about the development of this and why they did this. So, according to this Wikipedia article, this drama was not meant to clearly depict a particular event, but to hint at characters' lives at the events of Final Fantasy X-2. I don't know what they listened to, but I listened to something different. But the idea behind this is that Yoshinori Katase wanted Nojima to like kind of write something, kind of a little fun, little fluff to add on to this. And well, I can't say what their thoughts on this without spoiling a few things, but let's just say that we'll wrap it back around this. Let's just talk about the plot real quick. So this plot centers around two characters by the name of Chiwami and Kurgum. And here, I'll pull up a picture of them real quickly. This should be it. Yeah, it's these two little guys.
Okay.
So Chiwami there is 17, and she is the supposed daughter of Auron. Auron, of course, being the legendary guardian who was an unsent and kind of knew everything that was going on and was easily the coolest character of Final Fantasy X.
Right.
And the little kid there, of course, is Kurgum. Kurgum was basically going to be a summoner until the whole Sin getting blown up thing sort of happened. And so now he's not. But he's still, he's enamored with Yuna and really wants to meet him so badly. Just so badly. And, maybe his dreams are going to come true. So they end up walking down what's called Bavel Stadium Road, actually. And they run into Tidus. Well, that is Tidus, but that's not the Tidus I wanted to show y'all. I want to show this Tidus. So this Tidus looks cool as heck.
I hate this.
I actually really like this. So basically, imagine Tidus, but he has a red bandana, just like Jack did. Mm-hmm. So that's his deal. I think it looks good.
It's not that the design looks bad. I hate what it represents.
Oh, you maybe see where things are going here.
Yeah, also that.
So, it turns out airships work again, by the way. So, Chiwami and Kurgum end up going to Besaid Island because they want to meet with Lulu and Waka. They're going there on the behest of the Spira Council, which is run by Baralai, the former praetor of the New Yevon group. And they want to meet Yuna and talk to her about some weird stuff that's happening on the Moonflow, which is like a spiritual river that it's in the Spira continent. Hmm. And so this is mostly narrated from Chiwami's point of view. And they meet up with Lulu and Waka. And Waka explains that Yuna just kind of spends all day praying and trying to help out the people of the island who still believe in Yevon. And Chiwami is kind of rude. She's like, why do people still believe in Yevon? It's a fake religion. And Waka's like, well, no, it has some good things about it. It teaches you to respect your fellow man and not be a jerk and to share. And she's like, that's just common sense things though. And Waka's just like, listen, just shut up. Don't worry about it. We're not bothering anybody. Please don't speak like this to Yuna.
Who's Yuna praying to?
Nobody.
Okay.
Or at least, I don't know. Let me be more accurate about this. I don't know. So, they meet up with Yuna, who's has a very flat effect. She speaks kind of empty. And she's returned to her mannerisms and dress style from her summoner days, so no more hot pants. Mm-hmm. And apparently she's spending her time praying for Spira's peace, to whom, once again, we don't know. So Chiwami thinks this is dumb as heck and actually questions Yuna on this. And she's like, I just do what I have to do to help the people around here. That's just what I do. So Chiwami's like, hey, I got the sphere for you to take a look at. Baralai says it's very important. She's like, that's great. Okay, you can leave. And Kurgum's like, oh man, but I really wanted to meet you. And she's like, whatever. See you later. Oh, and so Chiwami's like, hey, you're being really rude. He spent his entire life hoping to meet you. Like, what's wrong with you? And she's like, fine, okay, hi, let's look at the sphere. And so what's on this sphere depicts something that should not be possible. So I never explained this, but in order to get across the moonflow, you have to ride on a giant elephant called a shoe puff. The thing is, there's only one shoe puff left. There was a mate, but the mate died when Sin attacked it. But in this sphere, there are now 2 shoe puffs. So it mysteriously just reappeared one morning, and Yuna freaks out about this. She's like, oh no, the shoe puff has been beckoned. So hey, we're back to beckoning. Somebody has the ability to beckon shoe puffs back into existence. Somebody really likes elephants, and he wanted those elephants back.
Oh my god. Okay.
To be fair, if I could beckon an animal back, I'd beckon back a dodo, because they seem like they'd be rad. Little puffins that just trust humans a little too much. Good old dodos. But so yeah, Kurgum, was like, hey, Yuna, you need to accompany us back to Bevel. And she's like, okay, yeah, sure. No, I'm pretty on board with this now. So before they leave, Chiwami talks with Lulu. And Lulu mentions that she heard that Chiwami is the daughter of Orin. And she's like, yep, totally am. And Lulu's like, no, you're not. And Chiwami's like, no, I really am. My mom told me Orin was my father. She's like, well, have you ever met Orin? She's like, no, he was apparently a baby when he left. And she's like, well, we have a lot of people who kind of show up here pretending that they're like Orin's kid or Jack's kid and just trying to get his belongings. And it just kind of feels like you're doing that again. And I know you can't be Orin's kid because Orin would never hide anything from us. Which is a lie.
Yeah, Orin hid literally everything from you.
Orin hid that he was an unsent. Orin hid Sin's true nature. Orin hid that the Yuan religion was a scam. Orin hid that Jack was Sin. What else do I want to name, Lulu? I mean, I got it. He's dead. You want to think the best of him. But let's slow our roll here. Let's slow our roll. But yeah, so Chiwami's like, hey, what, you telling me my mom's a liar? And she's like, I'm not going to go that far. Which is like, I mean, you did, but whatever. So there's something weird going on with that. So they end up traveling to the Moonflow, Kurgum, Chiwami, Waka, and Yuna. And for some reason they go on foot. This is explicitly mentioned. Don't know why. But the Moonflow, they see the shoe puff, and they also see a crowd of onlookers there, and they see that there's just a bunch more people all of a sudden. And it's kind of like if they were on the far plane, where they would see spirits of their dead loved ones. And like, this son is talking to like his now departed mom. It's like, hey mom, you're gonna come home, right? And his dad's like, hey, listen, no, that's not gonna happen. It's like the far plane. I'm sorry, sweetie, it's not gonna happen. But then the spirit responds back and says, oh, of course, yeah, let's go home. And so like, everyone's like, wait, hold on. These are actual people that are back. Dead loved ones are back. So it's like the dead are now crossing over into the living. And it's all of a sudden, it's really, really confusing. There's a really big implication for this. Because now Sin's back.
Okay.
Now, if it feels like that was a hell of a transition, that's because that's exactly how it was presented in the audio drama. It's literally like, this happens, and they're like, you hear battle noises, and it's like, oh no, Sin's back! And you're like, what? So somebody has beckoned Sin back into existence. Okay. Yeah! So they go back to Bevel, and Yuna realizes that the eternal calm was not to be at all. And she's like, I need to see Tidus. And Yuna had previously told Chiwami that Tidus was her boyfriend. And, like, she goes to talk with Tidus, and, like, Chiwami and Kurgum eavesdrop on the conversation between the two. And it seems like they're kind of breaking up, because, like, Yuna is, like, all of a sudden accuses him of, like, hey, man, you're talking to this girl named Marfi. What's going on with that? And Tidus is like, Marfi's just a friend of mine. I don't know what you're talking about. And soon she's like, you know what? I just don't care anymore, because there's somebody else I like.
I'm sorry, is the death whale not reincarnated?
You know, it's kind of funny because Chiwami, who's the most relatable person in this story, is like, makes a comment, it's like, they're having a lover's tiff? What the hell is going... Sin's back! And so, like, Tidus is like, hey, well, that sucks. I mean, if you're happy, I'm happy. Can I meet him? And she's like, no, you can't meet him. It's like, oh, well, is it at least somebody I know? She's like, you don't know him. He's like, oh, well, okay. And so Chiwami's like, man, this is so stupid. And she turns to Kurgum, who's crying. And Kurgum turns to Chiwami. He's like, Chiwami, I'm sorry, but we can't have a relationship because I'm in love with Yuna. And Chiwami, who right at the start of this audio drama is like, hey, I look over Kurgum and make sure he stays safe, but let me make it clear, we're not in a relationship. I would never be in a relationship with this man. It's like, our relationship's not like that. What are you talking about? Once again, most relatable person in this. She's like, everybody is acting crazy around here. So Kurgum, tears in his eyes, like, I have to go travel with you now. This is something that only summoners could understand. Which, first off, you're not a summoner, kid. It was firmly established you have no ability to be a summoner because summoners don't exist anymore. So yeah, it's so strange. It is so strange. So Chiwami goes off with Tidus and Kurgum goes off with Yuna, which I'm sure Yuna is totally pleased to have this kid who's like, guess what is at this point 6 years younger than him, just be like, I am totally in love with you, Yuna. I'm sure she is not annoyed by that. Like he's like traveling, like Chiwami and Tidus traveled back to Besaid, and they talked to Lulu. Mm-hmm. And Tidus is like, man, I guess yeah, Yuna loves somebody else. I wonder who it is. Like, do you know Lulu? And she's like, man, I thought you knew Yuna better than that. Maybe you should find out yourself. And so Tidus goes, oh, I get it. Because the whole point is that Tidus has changed.
Right.
And so she loves the man Tidus once was, and that's the whole point. And so Tidus goes, okay, well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to go protect Yuna and help defeat Sin. And Chiwami's like, well, why are you doing that? It's like, well, I made a promise I was going to do that, so I'm going to do it. Like, one thing I'll say about this is that this Tidus acts a lot more like the Tidus we know and love. Right. Unlike the novel, where Tidus is like a weird child with a mommy complex.
Right.
So they depart to go and meet up with Yuna, who is now giving a speech who's saying, hey, I'm going to defeat Sin once more. I don't know how, but I'm going to do it. And that's where the audio drama ends. So yeah, they completely have reset. And you see where this is going, right?
Yeah.
Tidus is going to become a final Aeon.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to probably find some other way to defeat Sin. But, that's how we're going to get rid of Tidus. He's going to fulfill the same thing that happened with his father. Yuna's going to fulfill the same thing that happened with her father. Because Nomura does not like a happy ending. At least not in this case.
Right.
I don't know how I do know how Final Fantasy 13 ends. But that's another...
It doesn't, is the short answer.
It kind of doesn't. It's cool. She's a model in France. Anyways.
So I feel like I've felt this before, which is I feel like I felt this when I was watching Evangelion. This feels like Nojima turning the Final Fantasy X fans and going, look at this. This is you. Look how stupid this is. This is what you sound like. You and your desires to continue this story and have a happy ending and blah blah blah. It's so stupid, it's so trite, it's so nonsensical. You're stupid.
So I can 100% see where you're coming from with that. I don't quite think that, but admittedly, I have a little bit of foreknowledge.
Oh, okay.
So that's definitely not fair on my part. And this is where we're going to get back into the development a bit. So the developers wanted to have the story continue as the direct opposite of Tidus's and Yuna's happy story, and thus Sin would be brought back.
What? What does that mean?
It means they hated the happy ending, and they were like, no, we got to reset this. Now, Katase commented that similar to Sephiroth's role in Final Fantasy VII, Sin plays an important role in Final Fantasy X, and developers wanted to keep Sin involved with the story.
I feel the same way about that statement. I feel about keeping Sephiroth involved in Final Fantasy VII, but that's a fight I'm not going to win, so we'll move on.
Yeah, with you on that. Well, I will say I am intrigued, and I'll leave it at that without spoiling a game that's very recent.
Yes.
So, the inclusion of Final Fantasy X will, on this, sparked speculation that people were thinking about, hey, they're going to make a Final Fantasy X-3. Which, yeah, no, 100%, this is what this was trying to lead to. 100%.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Nojima and Nomura apparently threw a little bit of water on that when they said that the audio episode's inclusion wasn't because they had any plans to develop a Final Fantasy X-3, and that's a direct quote. Now, Katase later comments in the same interview that they decided to include a voice drama. The staff was excited about the thought of making Final Fantasy X-3. He has lamented that most of the staff has been busy and they haven't been able to make it happen. And also, they've done this before. The whole Eternal Calm thing, which, admittedly, I feel like they probably made the decision to make a Final Fantasy X-2 well before that, because once again, Final Fantasy VII happened, they saw the aftermath, they wanted to capitalize.
Right.
So, I know the Eternal Calm wasn't the reason why they did that, but they claim that's the reason why. So then to do this and claim, oh, no, we're not doing this. No, what are you talking about?
This was 2016 this happened?
This was 2016.
Okay, yeah. So this was, right around the time 15 came out.
Mm-hmm.
And then I feel and then what happened is Square said, throw everything in the trash that's not called Kingdom Hearts 3. We're going to do Final Fantasy 7 now.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, they went all in on Final Fantasy 7 at that point.
Yeah.
Which, granted, so far is looking like the right move.
Yeah, no, compared to 10-3, Yuna Returns.
10-3, do you like Sin, a villain that barely was there and really just served as a metaphor? He's central to the story. It's yes, because he's a metaphor, but you can substitute him in for anything else.
But people like the whale, though.
I mean, Sin was a pretty cool force of nature. Once.
Sephiroth is a compelling and interesting villain. He's not. He's a vessel for an alien parasite.
Sephiroth was interesting until they changed his relationship with Genova. Then it stopped being interesting. But that's a story for another time, because we will talk about Final Fantasy VII one day. It will be a 6-part episode, and I will hate researching it.
Yeah,
that's a lot of novels I'll have to read, because they're all canon. But
they were all written by Nojima too.
They were also all written by Nojima. Oh, it's gonna be so good. It's gonna be so good. God. But yeah, undoubtedly there's going to be a Final Fantasy X-3 at some point. The nostalgia for it is too strong, and our society is so baked into the idea of safe bets and nostalgia, particularly in a high-stakes industry such as video games, that the idea that they would not make a new Final Fantasy X product is insane. Of course they will.
Yeah.
I don't know if they'll do this, but they will at some point.
The setup reminds me of Tales of Symphonia 2, which everyone hated.
Oh yeah, because Tales of Symphonia is the one that they really liked.
Yes, Tales of Symphonia is a fan favorite of the Tales series. It was incredibly well received. I don't know that it did anything in particular out of the ordinary for that series. It's just the one that landed. It's just the one that hit America at the right time. And
Yeah, that
people
sounds about
latched
right.
onto it. And then they were like, hey, let's make a follow-up to that with new characters following in the footsteps of the old ones. And also the old ones are there. And also new, but old, but new, but old. And everyone went, this is as trash as when Gundam Seed Destiny tried the same thing. Take it away.
Once
And
again, I
all
don't
I
want to
can-
talk about too much about Tales of Symphonia 2, but they did do the Gundam Seed Destiny thing where they just trashed the main cast and brought the old one back.
I'm pretty
halfway
sure,
through.
yeah. I'm pretty sure that happened as well.
Oh, God. So good.
I don't... And all I can think is, when will you stop doing this? Because it's never worked.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I don't know. I
that-
just... Go ahead.
For that matter, has a sequel to Final Fantasy ever been good?
Without spoiling things, yes.
Yeah, okay, fair. Prior to that one...
People do really like Final Fantasy 13-3, although the way those sequels
No,
work...
that game's stupid.
I mean, yes, but...
I'm sorry to
I've met
make
defenders.
I'm sorry to make my opinion on the matter, the law of the land, but also, no, that game's trash.
Alex, you got to stand your ground somewhere, and I respect you for that.
Honestly, I stand it on all of 13, but if nothing else, Lightning Returns is the one.
Yes. Well, one day we'll talk about that. And for now, we're going to be leaving the land of Final Fantasy X. Next time we do this, we'll be talking about something that will be not nearly as JRPG heavy. But in the meantime, I hope y'all took away a lot from this. I hope y'all took away what the concept of death is and how you can circumvent it in about 5 different ways if you just try hard enough.
I'm taking away that it's amazing that any Final Fantasy after 6 was good, actually. Because
Some
here's
people would say that about 4.
fair. Yeah, actually, what baffles me is that it's the same people who made Final Fantasy VII made Final Fantasy 13.
Oh yeah, the same people who made Final Fantasy VII are still with the company doing things.
And, like, they made 10, but also 13.
True. Though granted, I do have to say, like, Square, where they're at right now, I feel like they're in really good shape. I mean, these are the same people who are like, we're finishing Saga Frontier and putting it out.
Right.
Like, they're doing that. They're going, like, they're bringing back the Mana series in a really big way. They're doing things.
Yeah. But it's like, how are these specific people so hit or miss?
I honestly think there is one person there who's more hit than miss. Well, I think there's 2 people. I just think they occasionally get overruled.
Yeah.
Or get too many projects, in the case of Nomura.
Also true. But also, I guess that's creativity.
That indeed is.
Sometimes you have a really good idea, and then sometimes you think you have a really good idea, and the world says, that's dumb.
Yep.
Why are the bombs shaped like blitz balls?
So Tidus will go up to it and be like, it's a blitz ball! Oh no!
But where did the boat come from?
Oh, the boat's just been there forever.
But why?
It was a rusty boat. Gotta have the face somewhere. You know, and listen, like, Infernal's like low rent. He's not Yu Yevon. He can't put him on a secret mountaintop. He just has to get a boat. I'm sorry. I don't have a mansion to put all my video games in, so I just kind of stuff them in a corner, you know? That's just how I roll. But that's going to be it for us today, everybody. I hope you all are feeling incredibly enlightened and are, you know, pleased or at least less confused about what the world of Final Fantasy X is all about. Mason, do you have any parting thoughts?
I think I'm more confused than ever before. More
Fantastic.
confused than I would have thought possible.
You know, in many ways, I'm happy to have accomplished that.
I have a parting thought.
All right, hit us.
Blitzball's still terrible.
I mean, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Well, with that, everybody, we'll see you in, I guess, probably 2 weeks or something like that. Take care.